She'll go for milk and will throw her stuff away. Margaret accidentally overhears her daughter-in-law talking to her son. Margaret was born and raised in a rural family. Her mother worked on the farm all her life. Her father worked as a driver. Margaret and her little sister Vanessa cleaned the house, cooked and looked after the livestock from a young age. Their parents had no time for work. They earned money. In the evening, they would come home tired and their daughters would look after them. They would set the table, pour tea, and bring clean towels after washing. It was the order of the day. From childhood, Margaret dreamed of becoming a teacher. Perhaps her first teacher played a big role in this. She was a beautiful, very intelligent young girl who had barely graduated from the institute. She spoke intelligently and calmly, knew the answers to all the questions, and skillfully motivated the class for successful study. She had no laggards. Even the weakest tried and stretched to please. Gwen. Margaret remembered how she had sobbed when her favorite teacher's practice was over and she had gone home. And she hadn't been the only one upset then. Ever since then, the girl had been determined that when she grew up, she would become a teacher. As good and kind as Gwen. Margaret never changed her mind. She studied well and, having finished school, easily entered the university. Margaret was given a room in a dormitory. It was so unusual. The girl had never been away from her parents and sister for more than a couple of days. And now, all of a sudden, it was like this. It was scary and hard at first. But Margaret was quickly drawn in. She liked her studies, her classmates, her teachers. She realized more and more clearly that she had chosen the right path. Being a teacher was really her calling. After receiving her diploma, Margaret got her first job in her life. She was hired at the local city school and at a prestigious language gymnasium. And they offered her a salary that the young girl could never have dreamed of. Margaret plunged headlong into her work. She liked everything: to teach, to answer the numerous questions of her children, to write notes for lessons, and to deal with interesting and difficult cases at the pedagogical council. The young specialist was noticed and appreciated. It was nice to receive compliments from experienced colleagues. Margaret felt really happy. Vanessa, her sister, had also moved to the city, graduated from the College of Economics, got a job at the meat processing plant in the administrative office, even got married, and very successfully. Ashley, the son of the director of the plant, fell in love with the young, pretty employee. The guy was from a wealthy family, handsome, educated, witty. Perhaps his parents were at first against the bride from the village, but after getting to know Vanessa better, they loved and accepted her. Of course they did. Beautiful, hard-working, faithful, kind. The young lived in their own flat, which had 3 spacious rooms and a huge loggia. Ashley's parents had given it to them as a wedding present. Margaret was genuinely happy for her sister. But her personal life wasn't going well. Back in her university days, Margaret had had several unsuccessful romances. They all followed the same pattern. At first, the girl began to charm the next suitor, saw him as an ideal man, mentally preparing for the wedding. Then came the epiphany, bringing heartache and almost disgust to the one who had recently been the meaning of Margaret's life. Somehow her suitors turned out to be infantile, spoiled creatures, selfish as well. Insecure, weak. No, Margaret could not commit her life to such a man. The bitterness and disappointment after each breakup was long-lasting. That's why Margaret decided to take a break. I don't care about those men. They're so frustrating. Better to get on with her career. And then, one day he came into the life of a young teacher. Andrew, a modest, even a little stiff and short guy with blue eyes and a nice smile. For the first time, they saw each other in the school gym on the eve of 1st September. Andrew was leading a team of craftsmen who were hurriedly completing repairs at the school. The young men met their eyes. Margaret immediately realized that this man had something for her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. He wasn't that handsome. Quiet, unremarkable. And he flushed to the roots of his hair at the sight of Margaret and turned away, embarrassed. It seemed very sweet and touching. Margaret realized that he liked her too at first sight. Then Margaret met Andrew every day, and he invariably hid his eyes from her. But the girl began to notice that the guy secretly looks at her when he thinks that she does not see it, and it was very pleasant and exciting. And one day Andrew suddenly gathered courage. It was on the eve of the site handover. One last chance to get to know each other. Job done. Andrew has nothing more to do at the school. so he'd never see Margaret again. So the boy took a desperate and difficult step. Andrew spoke quietly and simply, no florid phrases. But his speech was so sincere, so touching. Margaret, of course, melted and agreed to go out with the guy. Andrew had no idea that she had been waiting for this invitation for a long time and was beginning to worry that she would never get it. And then what to do? She wouldn't be the one to hang around his neck, would she? Andrew invited Margaret to the cinema. The girl was not worried before the first date. She saw that she liked Andrew very much, felt the warmth emanating from him, and therefore was sure that their meeting would go as it should. If only Andrew would relax a little, because he was very shy. After that first date, Margaret realized that Andrew was completely her person. They were so good, so easy together. Both told each other about their lives and destinies. Andrew was raised by his grandmother. His parents died when the boy was only 6 years old. So there he was left with his paternal grandmother, already a very elderly woman. She was an old-school lady and believed that children should be brought up in strictness, especially boys. So Andrew's childhood could not be called happy, warm, and carefree. No, the boy didn't complain. He just told me how he grew up and grew up. It was Margaret, sensitive and attentive Margaret. She was drawing her own conclusions. She felt sorry for this wonderful boy. She wanted to hug him, to kiss him, to give him some warmth and care. After all this he lacked so much in childhood. Andrew went into the army after high school. Then he came back, trained as a welder. However, he failed to find a job in his profession, but he became a foreman of a repair team. Not an easy job either. Still, the boy never gave up hope of becoming a welder. And wages there are higher, and in general. He'd learned so much for a reason. Andrew lived in a rented flat, just like Margaret. When he was just a kid, some clever relatives had sold his parents' house. There was no end in sight, so the lad had to start from scratch. But he was not discouraged and did not complain about life, although fate entreated him rather unfairly. Andrew was very kind and caring, unlike Margaret's previous beau. He always asked if she was hungry, and on chilly evenings he threw his jacket over her shoulders to keep her warm. With Andrew, the girl felt loved and desired. It seemed that he was ready to do anything for her. It was a wonderful feeling. Margaret realized that she was in love. And the feeling was completely mutual. There was no doubt about it. Andrew looked at her with such eyes and tried so hard to make her feel good around him. It was impossible not to notice. Margaret wasn't surprised when Andrew proposed to her and happily accepted. She had long wanted to live next to Andrew in the same flat, to take care of each other, to support each other, and it was more fun together. Margaret was tired of returning to an empty, cold room. Vanessa at first was not delighted with her sister's choice. "You're young, you're pretty, you could easily find someone richer. My Ashley has so many friends. They're all handsome and the sons of rich parents. Are you going to roll around with them like a cheese and butter?" Vanessa asked. "What about Andrew? Never a decent job or prospects." But after getting to know Andrew better, Vanessa changed her mind. "He's a good man," smiled her sister, sharing her impressions with Margaret. "Very kind, and he loves you very much. Everything will be fine with you. You will achieve everything together. You can't miss a man like that. I'm so happy for you. Andrew and Margaret got married. They lived in his rented flat, and Margaret's golden years began. The young husband tried to help his wife in every way. He did a lot of things for her, and even as he had once dreamed, found a new job, got a job as a welder at a construction site. He took part-time jobs, did not refuse the opportunity to earn money, as he was saving for his own flat. Andrew dreamed of buying a 2-bedroom flat in a prestigious neighborhood with many good schools and playgrounds, so that his and Margaret's future children would have a happy childhood. Andrew often made surprises to his young wife. He would give her a ring, or just come home with a bouquet. Margaret felt the happiest in the world and thanked fate for such a loving and caring husband. The young couple spent hours talking about everything in the world, discussing films, stories from the lives of friends or relatives, making plans. Sometimes they argued, but always found a compromise. They liked the same films and books. Both discovered something new and interesting to each other. For example, with Andrew, Margaret became interested in hiking in the woods, and Andrew, thanks to his young wife, fell in love with the theater. Margaret was sure that she and Andrew were soulmates, halves of the same whole. Even though the couple lived poorly, they had enough to live on. Both did not seek excesses like a luxury car or annual trips to the sea. But they were happy to have each other, and often remembered that chance meeting at school, which might not have been. Margaret took a holiday in August, as her bosses had suggested, and then Oliver was born. How happy the young couple had been over his arrival. The new father glowed with pride as he held his son in his arms for the first time. Andrew turned out to be a wonderful parent, attentive, sensitive, caring. He could drive around for hours after work with a pram to give his young wife a rest. But Margaret most often went for a walk with her husband. It was so pleasant to walk together with Andrew, holding the handle of the pram and talking to the man she loved about everything in the world in a low voice, so as not to wake her son. The young parents liked to make plans for the future. They still did not have their own flat, but the amount in the bank account was slowly but surely growing. Just a little more, and the couple would be able to afford to buy their own place. At the same time, Vanessa, Margaret's sister, had a daughter, Ellie. The young mothers often visited each other and learned together the wisdom of caring for babies. The sisters shared advice and discussed the successes and failures of their babies. Margaret felt truly happy, and her husband was so loving and understanding. And her sister was close by. The young couple often dreamed about how their son would grow up. Surely he will be clever, kind, brave, will become, perhaps, a scientist or a craftsman. And they, the parents, will try to ensure that the innate talents of their child to open up and gain strength. It is only necessary to be attentive and patient. Andrew planned to do a lot with his son, to support him, always be there for him. In a difficult moment, Margaret was happy about it. On the soul was easy and calm. The two of them would manage. The child will grow up a good man. But the dreams of the couple were not destined to come true. A few years after the birth of their son, misfortunes one after another fell on their small family. First came the financial crisis, as a result of which the couple's savings depreciated. They were only a short time away from buying their own flat. The goal was so close, but after what had happened, the money accumulated in the account could only buy a couple of winter jackets, and that only if they were very lucky. Oliver had already started kindergarten. Margaret was out of maternity leave. The couple had a hard time getting over what had happened, even crying. Andrew couldn't help crying either. He thought that his wife did not see, but she noticed everything. The man even looked for a flat, the one he had dreamed of for a long time. A spacious two-bedroom apartment not far from a large school and a sports center where Oliver could go swimming. And then it was a blow. But there was no time for despondency. Times were tough. Margaret's salary at the school had been delayed for months. Things were not going well at the building site either. Andrew's main income was now part-time work. The man spent all day long on them to feed his family. As time went on, Oliver grew up and it was time for him to go to first grade. The family seemed to be adjusting to the new conditions. Andrew's part-time job kept them afloat. The man was making plans for his own flat again. There were hopes for a better life, glimmered ahead of a happy future. Then tragedy struck at the construction site. Andrew was moonlighting. The owners of the site were economizing on everything and didn't care much about safety. Andrew knew he was taking a risk, but he was always careful and acted as carefully as possible. But this time, during the construction of a supermarket building, a man fell from the third floor directly onto the concrete blocks piled up below. Of course, Andrew didn't survive. The paramedics who arrived could only pronounce him dead. Margaret wasn't told the terrible news until the morning. For her, the whole world turned upside down and faded away. She could not even cry for a long time. The woman felt her heart and soul literally torn in two. It didn't feel like living. How and why get up in the morning, if there is now no nearest and dearest person? Margaret realized that she would never meet anyone like Andrew again. There was no one else like him. And she didn't need anyone else. She missed his smile, his look, his smell, his warmth. Physically, it was painful from the impossibility to embrace the person she loved. There were his things around: clothes, books, glasses. But Andrew himself would never come home again, hug her and her son, joke with them. How to accept that? To dull the pain. Margaret even took up the bottle. Margaret realized, of course, that this was a dead end. But at that moment, she didn't care, just as long as she could get rid of the unbearable pain for a moment. There was no telling what would have happened to the woman if it hadn't been for Vanessa. She took Oliver in for a while. She had seen that his mother was not only unable to look after the child, but couldn't even manage herself. Margaret didn't care. Oliver was taken away, and that was fine. She didn't even think about her own child's feelings, but he was in pain and scared too. What brought Margaret back to life, oddly enough, was Oliver's illness. He caught pneumonia and ended up in hospital. Vanessa came to her sister in tears to tell her what had happened. She felt guilty. She had not looked after her nephew. He had a high fever and was delirious, Vanessa said. At first the doctor and I thought it was stress. His father had died and his mother was in a strange state. But then it became obvious it was more serious than that. He was in intensive care for 24 hours. He seems better now. But the doctor says it's too early to relax. Are you drinking? It's time to get my life back. Enough already, we can't bring Andrew back. We're going to lose another boy. The situation brought Margaret back to life. She was scared for her son, more scared than she'd ever been in her life. She pulled herself together, stopped drinking, regained her job, and of course, became a caring and loving mother again. Every day, Margaret now traveled to see her son in hospital. At first, she stood under the windows, and then, when Oliver was allowed to leave, she walked with him for hours in the hospital courtyard. Oliver somehow grew up at once. Trouble had turned the 7-year-old boy into a little old man with sad eyes. He was surprisingly thin, pale, and silent. Looking at her son, Margaret realized that he was under deep stress. Her baby is traumatized and needs a strong mother. And she, Margaret, had given up, drowning in her own grief, forgetting about the person who needed her support. From then on, Margaret became the perfect mother, attentive, fully focused on her son, caring. Margaret could not stay in the city. The rent was too expensive. The woman did not earn so much. She had to return to the village. Her father was gone. His life was taken by a heart attack 2 years earlier. And her mother, the elderly Maggie, was in great need of support and care. It was getting hard for her to manage the household on her own. So Margaret's move came at a good time. Oliver went to first grade at the village school. Margaret took a job as a teacher. But soon she had to think about changing jobs. The salaries at the school were very different from those at the city grammar school. It was impossible to live on such crumbs, and Margaret had to pull the child alone to put him on his feet. A neighbor, Aunt Gray, had a good idea. Her nephew had a shop in the central market. He sold clothes, shoes, accessories. He needed a salesman, someone decent, someone he could trust. His nephew promised Aunt Margaret a good salary, Aunt Nura said. He also offered a percentage of the proceeds. Margaret was also quite happy with the 2x2 schedule. It was hard, of course, to part with her dream job. After all, teaching kids is Margaret's true calling. The woman knew from childhood what she wanted to be. But what can you do when times are so hard? She and Oliver need something to eat. What wouldn't you do for a child? It was with great regret that Margaret left school. She missed her pupils, her colleagues, and her school life for a long time. Her heart sank every time she saw children dressed in uniform on the street. But new realities awaited Margaret. Working in the market was not easy. Capricious customers who didn't know what they wanted. Scandalous traders, competitors, the material responsibilities, and traveling took up a lot of time and energy. On days when Margaret went to work, she had to get up at the crack of dawn and walk almost 2 kilometers to the nearest bus stop in town. But the pay was good. Now Margaret could buy her son beautiful clothes and toys, and even every summer they flew to the seaside resort. And her mother helped to look after her son. She was already very old, of course, but she had enough time and energy for her grandson. Margaret often went to visit Vanessa. She didn't work, she was busy with the house and her daughter. She could afford it. Her husband earned enough to provide for the family. That's how your fate turned out, Vanessa often pitied her sister. You work as hard as you can, spinning as hard as you can. I even feel embarrassed to be a housewife. What about you? Everyone has their own fate, Margaret sighed. I'm not complaining about mine. Oliver and I have everything. There's no need to worry about it. Margaret was genuinely happy about Vanessa's life. She adored both her sister and her niece Ellie, but as her own daughter. The 4 of them often went out together, traveled somewhere together. In general, they lived friendly soul to soul. It was Vanessa who advised Margaret to save up some money and invest it in shares of a large company. "Ashley says it's the right thing to do," Vanessa said. "We have a lot of money invested in those stocks ourselves. My husband is sure that everything will be great in the end. And Ashley's smart, he knows." Margaret listened to her sister and, without a word to anyone, bought a few shares. The capital was growing, but very slowly. It was impossible to get rich by such interest, as it seemed at first. But Margaret decided to let the money lie on deposit. But she did not tell her son or her mother about the shares. "I don't think they'll approve," Margaret thought. "They would say it was a waste of money. Let the family live in peace." So Margaret had her own little secret. Now she was saving money, buying shares, saving for a happy future for her son. Oliver grew up to be a smart, athletic boy, unlike his modest, quiet father. He was the soul of the company. He always had a lot of friends, comrades. The guy walked a lot, laughed, socialized. He was a very cheerful and carefree person. "What a lad he's grown up to be." Margaret rejoiced. Self-confident, brave, intelligent. Just the kind of son Andrew and I imagined when we walked around the neighborhood with the pram. Oliver dreamed of becoming a lawyer, but to enter the coveted faculty he lacked just a little bit. The guy had to go to the army. Returning, he decided to try his luck in the city. His mother supported her son's decision and even helped financially by renting Oliver a flat. "Go, try, dare," she said. "Just be careful and know that no matter what happens, you can always come home, here, in this house." "Thank you," Oliver smiled. "But I'm not going back. I'm going to make my way in the city. There are so many opportunities there, so many prospects. Something will come of it." Bon voyage. Margaret smiled. It was scary to let her son go, but what can you do? The boy has grown up. It was time for him to start his own life. Oliver entered a construction college and at the same time got a job at the factory. He studied, worked, and paid his own rent. Often came to the village to visit his mother and grandmother Gwen. He always turned up with gifts and funny stories. Margaret's mother had given up on him. She hardly ever left the house, and sometimes she didn't even recognize her own daughters. One day she had a heart attack. Margaret called an ambulance. Mum was taken to hospital. The old woman never came back. "What do you want?" "Age." The doctor sighed tiredly. "Nobody lives forever." Margaret and Vanessa organized a funeral in the village. There were a lot of people at the wake. Everyone knew Mum here, after all. And then Vanessa told her sister to take over her parents' house. "I don't want half the inheritance," Vanessa said. "I don't need it, you know. What about you? Have you looked after Mum these last few years? It's hard work, so it's only fair that you get the house." Margaret didn't mind. She really needed her own corner. Old age was fast approaching. The woman sometimes marveled at how quickly her life had flown by. It seemed as if she and Andrew had just had Oliver. They were young, full of plans and hopes, beautiful. And now Oliver is a grown-up, independent man. Andrew is gone, and she's almost an old woman herself. What lies ahead? Margaret thought. Only retirement and a quiet, peaceful existence in a country cottage. Oliver is my only hope. He will marry, his grandchildren will be born, the little ones will come to visit their grandmother, and then there will be joy in life. By the way, Oliver is a good man, Margaret thought aloud. He hadn't given up his dream of going to law school. He got in after all. It was hard on him, working and studying, but he'll get through it. I'll be there to help and support him. Vanessa said it was time to live for yourself. You're young, you're still beautiful. Oliver's all grown up. Now you can treat yourself. You've got a good salary, you've got savings. Let's go to Italy or Greece. You've never been abroad before. We'll take a walk there, have a rest. What Greece, what Italy? Margaret smiled back. I have a grown-up son, Oliver, who is getting married soon. I guess I'll have to help him with the wedding and the flat. That's what I'm saving up for. No time for holidays. He's a grown man now, Vanessa persisted. He's so strong and handsome. He'll manage on his own, and you need to think about yourself sometimes. But Margaret didn't agree. It was different for her sister husband Ashley and son Harry were born into a wealthy family. Their futures were planned 100 years in advance and secured. True, Jen's niece, despite her rich parents, had grown up wise, modest, sensible. Simple, natural, pleasant. And independent, too. Like Oliver, Jen worked from an early age. A golden girl. When Margaret had argued with her sister that Oliver would need her support for the foreseeable future, she'd been right. Shortly after that conversation, the son came to visit his mother for the weekend. He was somehow mysterious, not as he always was. Margaret immediately realized that something was wrong. The woman quickly assembled the table, put out her son's favorite treats, fried potatoes with mushrooms, pancakes and pickles from the cellar. Then she watched with pleasure as Oliver devoured it all. At the table, the young man shared some exciting news with his parents. "Mom, I'm getting married," he said. "How are you getting married?" Margaret's questions poured out of Margaret like a cornucopia of questions. To whom? When? The woman was overwhelmed by a storm of emotions: joy, anxiety, surprise. "Her name is Julia," Oliver answered. "You're going to love her. I'll bring her here next weekend. You two should get to know each other before we get married. I just wanted to warn you." At first, Margaret nodded her head with a smile. She knew, of course, that the moment would come sooner or later, but still the news took her by surprise. Wow, Oliver's getting married, all grown up, she thought. Julia worked as a waitress in a cafe, her son said. "I often went there for a bite to eat. That's how we met." Julia is also from the country. She was also brought up by a single mother. See how much we have in common. Julia came to the city to go to law school. Another coincidence. That's amazing. She dreamed of working for the law, helping out, catching criminals. And she's so fragile, so thin. What kind of policeman would she be? She failed her college exams, but she didn't want to go back home to the village. Oliver continued. What would she do there? She grew up in a small village in the middle of nowhere, in a poor family. Her mother had 5 younger children besides her. Julia didn't want to go back to her old life. So she took a job as a waitress in a cafe. She got a room in a hostel, so she lived a little, worked a little. "How long have you two been together?" Margaret asked. 6 months. Almost Oliver smiled. Margaret knew from that smile that her son was in love. "She's a good girl, taking care of me. She cleans the house, she cooks. We've been living together for 4 months now, almost in my rented flat. The other day I proposed to her." "So that's it," Margaret said. "There's so much to prepare. To book a wedding hall, to find outfits for the bride and groom, to hire a presenter, to plan the menu, and to send out invitations." "Mom, we've decided we're going to do without all that," Oliver said simply. "We'll just do it quietly at the registry office, that's all." "As you wish," Margaret nodded. She'd painted a picture in her head of her only son's ideal wedding a long time ago. It was a joyous celebration, with a crowd of dressed-up guests, a ringing toastmaster, a huge cake, and a table bursting with treats. Decorated with balloons and ribbons, cars, dancing. A beautiful bride and a happy groom. But if the young people decided differently, so be it. After all, it's their holiday. The following weekend, Oliver came to his mother's house with the bride. Margaret did her best to prepare a sumptuous table. She made salads and meat. The appetizers on the plates could have made a poem, Margaret thought. She was very anxious to please her future daughter-in-law, to show Julia that she was welcome in the house. The guests were carefully prepared for their arrival. They were careful not to say the wrong thing, so that Oliver would not be ashamed of his mother. Julia was a thin girl of short stature, with large dark eyes, thin eyebrows, and thick fringes. She was dressed simply but tastefully, an elegant dress, low-heeled shoes. At first the guests and the hostess felt a little uneasy. Julia, looking round carefully, was silent. Apparently she was too shy to say a word. Only after a while did Margaret realize that this modesty was feigned. Julia was just looking around, choosing a tactic of behavior, drawing conclusions. The atmosphere at the table was resolved by Oliver. He joked, amused his ladies, threw up interesting topics for conversation. Oliver was always so lively, energetic, companionable. During the conversation, it turned out that Julia was really from a very poor and disadvantaged family. The girl charmed Margaret at the first meeting with her modesty. Oliver's fiancée had a very sweet smile. And how did she look at her fiancé? Her eyes shone with tenderness and love. The boy, however, answered Julia in the same way. He held her hand, now and then hugged her around the waist. There was love and harmony between them. Margaret looked at them and her heart rejoiced. Oliver and Julia were married. Margaret suggested that the young people have a celebration in a cafe. Not a real wedding with a host and decorated cars, but a proper celebration with their friends. She'd even put up the money for it. Margaret had savings. Over the years, the woman had managed to put aside a certain amount. Plus the shares, bought on her sister's advice, had risen in value. At first, Margaret dreamed of buying a flat in the city. But then she realized that she could live quite well in the village. It was quiet, peaceful, and close to familiar and friendly people. Margaret liked the very atmosphere that reigned in her village. Towards retirement, the woman realized that she did not want to move anywhere, even though she had enough money to buy a small flat. Only Vanessa, her sister, knew about the savings. Margaret didn't talk about her wealth, not even to her son. She wanted Oliver to grow up independently, to try to earn his own money for a place to live and achieve something in life. But if he failed, his mother would always help him in a difficult situation. The means are there, but only for the time being. He wasn't supposed to know about it, to make his own way. The money was in a bank account. Margaret had invested some of it in shares a few years ago on the advice of her husband and sister, and the money was now earning a good income. And for her son's wedding, Margaret had withdrawn a sum that she estimated would be enough for a sumptuous celebration. Margaret wanted to give the young couple a gift. On her son's next visit, she handed Oliver a puffy envelope. Wow, he marveled as he looked inside. What a surprise. Where did you get it? I saved up, Margaret smiled. Make a holiday of it all you want. Go to a restaurant with your friends. Don't deny yourself anything. Have fun. Thank you, Oliver smiled. We'd better save that money for the flat. Why rent? You both make enough money. And a wedding is only once in a lifetime. Well, ideally, of course. I'm having trouble with my job, Oliver admitted. It's not paying much, and it's unstable out there. I could be out of the hospital. What about Julia? Doesn't she make enough money? They don't pay a waitress $1 million. It's all right, Margaret said, patting her grown-up son on the shoulder. He's all grown up, Oliver, and he's a big man himself. And his problems are just as grown-up: financial matters, family maintenance. I feel sorry for him, of course, but we all go through it. Don't worry, son. You'll finish your studies and find a better job. You're my good boy. You're so smart, handsome, and educated. Everywhere with open arms will be accepted with open arms. Oliver sighed heavily. I was expelled. How? Margaret gasped. Why? For truancy? Oliver said quietly. I had to work a lot, so I didn't get to class. I had a lot of absences. I thought I'd make it, but I couldn't. So I got expelled. That's all right, Margaret said, pulling herself together. Oliver needed support now. It wasn't the first or the last to recover and finish his studies. I don't want to finish my studies. Oliver snapped at her. I'm a grown man. I'm just sitting in the classroom, wiping my trousers. It's funny. You have to earn money, not suffer with nonsense. Margaret didn't argue with her son. He was not in the right state to realize anything, and then she would change his mind. Education is necessary for a young man, otherwise you can't build a career. The woman will definitely convey this to her adult and only child. Now you need to support him, calm him down, encourage him. Well, if you don't want a wedding, you can do what you like with that money, Margaret nodded to Oliver. Thank you, Mama. Oliver smiled happily. The money will be very useful to us now. I'm glad to help. You're all grown up and practical. Other people would be happy to spend money on a holiday, but you're thinking about the future. I have to. Oliver sighed. Her son left and Margaret stayed at home with a troubled heart. She was worried about Oliver. He hadn't finished his studies. He didn't have a proper job. He didn't have a place to live. Now he was getting married. If the children came, Oliver would have to work at unskilled labor from morning till night to provide for his family. This was not the future Margaret had dreamed of for her only child. He's a grown man. He'll sort it out, her sister Vanessa reassured her over the phone that evening. What are you worried about? You've done everything you had to do. It's up to him now. Shouldn't we give him money for a flat? Margaret consulted Vanessa. It'd be easier on the young people. At least they wouldn't have to pay rent. Let him pay, objected her elder sister. Don't even think of mentioning that money now. They'll sit on their necks and shrink from it. But they will try to get out of the situation. Maybe they'll succeed. And you can always give them the flat as a present. It's not time yet. You're right, Vanessa, you're right, Margaret agreed. Of course, said her sister, grinning. Come and visit me. Come tomorrow, we'll go to a film, sit in a cafe. You need to unwind. You're right again, Margaret smiled. I'm so lucky to have a sister like that, someone close to me who's always there to cheer me up. Oliver and Julia were married. The wedding took place in the city registry office in a modest and quiet manner. Margaret, Vanessa, and Ellie and Julia's two girlfriends attended the ceremony. Afterwards, a small group of people had a modest celebration in a cafe. They sat for a short time, made a few toasts to the newlyweds, presented them with gifts, and left. Julia had to go to her shift, and Oliver was waiting for her at work. What a wedding, Margaret said disappointedly when she and her sister were alone. The women decided to do a little shopping. Oh, come on, Vanessa said nonchalantly. Young people don't care about anything these days, as long as they lived well. Did Oliver and Julia have a good life? Margaret had no idea. Her son tried not to talk to his mother about it, and she didn't feel comfortable asking, prying into a grown man's soul. The young people came to visit occasionally. Julia behaved politely, but coldly and aloofly. Margaret noted that there seemed to be a good relationship between the young couple. Oliver's work was not going well. He changed places and employers, looking for a decent income, but nothing worked. Oliver didn't want to think about going back to university. Margaret was tempted several times to tell her son that she had a financial safety cushion, which she was ready to give him. She wanted to support Oliver, to take the despair out of his eyes. But the woman held back. We need to let the young ones try to get back on their feet on their own. It's important. It's not like they're so needy right now. Yes, it's hard, but they're two adults who should be able to cope. But if there's a baby, then it's a different matter. Children should live in normal conditions, with calm, peaceful parents. It's been a few years. The situation in the son's family did not change. He was still looking for a job. Oliver went from being a jolly joker Balaguer to a scowling man. Margaret thought it was because of money problems. But one day she happened to witness a conversation between her son and Julia. The couple had come to visit Margaret. It had been happening less and less lately. The woman went into the kitchen to take a goose roasted with apples out of the oven. When she returned with the tray in her hands, she witnessed an ugly scene. You're nothing but a worthless man. Julia looked at Oliver with dislike. You can't do anything. Rachel married Andrew. He got her a cool phone for her birthday, and they're going on holiday to the Emirates soon. And you can't even afford a spa day for the woman you love. What about a spa? We're about to be evicted from our flat for non-payment. Oliver lowered his head in silence. He had nothing to say. The young man must have felt really worthless at that moment. Margaret's heart clenched with pity for her son. Wow. Did Julia often humiliate him in this way if she couldn't help it when she visited him? And Oliver hung his head too habitually. He was not even surprised, nor did he try to defend himself. And Julia, it turned out, was a real piece of work. She pretended to be modest at first. It cost Margaret a great deal of labor to pull herself together. One must not show one's true attitude to the situation. In fact, she must pretend that she had neither seen nor heard anything. Her interference would only spoil everything. Julia will have the opportunity to call Oliver a mama's boy, and she'd have a hard time with her mother-in-law, that's for sure. No, let them sort it out themselves, they're adults. For the rest of the evening, until the young people left, Margaret kept neutral, talking on distracted subjects, smiling at both spouses, and trying not to notice the fixed sadness in her son's eyes. When the children left, it was obvious to Margaret. Oliver is madly in love with Julia. And it is immediately clear he is ready to turn mountains for her sake. He tries, he fights, but he fails. Largely because Oliver never finished school. And he didn't finish his studies because of Julia. He had to work hard to satisfy the demands of his beloved. Margaret twitched herself. She had to be objective. After all, it had been Oliver's choice to drop out of university and get a job. Yes, in many ways it had come out of a desire to please Julia. But it was Oliver's own decision. How can I help my son now? Margaret thought again about the money in the account. Maybe we should give it to Oliver. Let him buy a flat. It would make Julia feel better. Margaret was accustomed to consult her sister Vanessa on serious matters, so she rang her sister. "You're mad," Vanessa exclaimed when she heard her sister's reasoning. "Don't buy Oliver a flat now. Don't you realize that it would be considered marital property? They've only been together a little over a year. What if there's a divorce? Julia would take half of it without blinking an eye. I understand if they had kids. Then at least the grandkids would get everything. But as it is, there's no telling who's going to get it." Margaret realized her sister was right again. There's so much to consider, it's hard to keep in one's head. "It's not easy being a mother to a grown-up son," Margaret sighed. "It's not easy being a mother at all, but sometimes it's nice," her sister countered. A few more years passed. Margaret could see that her son was unhappily married. Oliver was still looking for a decent living. He did everything he could. He worked as a shift worker, tried to start a business, and worked as a trucker, but he didn't stay anywhere for long. Then the company went bankrupt. Then the next medical examination did not pass. Finally, Oliver gave up, tired of being disappointed. One day he arrived at his mother's house suddenly, unannounced, alone. "We can't afford to live in Seattle," he sighed. "It's too expensive for us. We're going back to Claremont. We'll live with you for a while. Do you mind?" Margaret shook her head in surprise. "Good," Oliver nodded. "In that case, we'll come back next week." Margaret was at a loss for words after her son's departure. Are they going to live together here in the village? What kind of a strange decision is that? There's not even much work here. What do Oliver and Julia expect? But Margaret did not argue with her son. She could see he was having a hard enough time as it was. All right, let them try. They're probably just looking for a way out of a difficult situation. They're considering a life in the country. Well, we can do that. The city didn't work out. Life together with Oliver and Julia began with a turf war. "Mom, we're going to live in the living room," said Oliver. "Why?" Margaret was surprised. She had prepared a corner bedroom for the young couple. She thought it was the coziest and most remote room, and would be more comfortable for the young people. "Because it's the biggest and brightest room," Oliver replied simply. Margaret realized later that her son was broadcasting Julia's will. He was always trying to please his wife. He loved his young wife more than his life, and she took advantage of that. Julia immediately showed her true face to her mother-in-law, not even trying to pretend to be polite or modest. She didn't like everything Margaret did. Her mother-in-law didn't cook properly, too fatty, unhealthy food. She didn't know how to set a table. And she didn't even scrub the floors properly. Julia often made contemptuous remarks to Margaret. "Why do you rattle your dishes in the morning and disturb your sleep? Or do your friends laugh too loudly? And anyway, can't you get together somewhere else in the evening now?" At first, Margaret was at a loss for words at her sister-in-law's insolence. But then, of course, she thought of appropriate responses to Julia's barbs. She wanted to remind the young woman that she was not in her own house and that she should behave more modestly. But Margaret refrained for her son's sake. She saw how much he was attached to Julia, loved and worshipped her. The young husband tried to fulfill every whim of his wife. There were many whims. Oliver did not cope and felt guilty. Julia fueled this guilt in him. She often mentioned the husbands and boyfriends of her acquaintances, who lavished jewelry on their loved ones and literally showered them with money. Margaret understood the purpose of all this talk. Julia manipulated Oliver, played on his feelings, used her spouse, suppressed. But she wasn't even trying to open her son's eyes. He wasn't in the right state of mind now anyway, too blinded by love and passion. Margaret sincerely did not understand what her son found in this Julia. Well, yes, she was pretty, but there's a lot of them out there, and yet such strong feelings. It seemed that if Julia asked him to jump off a cliff, he'd do it gladly. Oliver got a job at the local sawmill. It was hard work, physically exhausting. But the pay was good. Enough to periodically take Julia to the city, then to shopping, then to a restaurant. The young wife herself did not bother to work. Well, where can I find a suitable place here in the village? She sighed. And in the city every day, Margaret, go to the city. All of them. I used to go, Margaret suddenly remembered. I had no husband, and I had a baby to raise. I had to get from here to the central market every day. Why are you comparing different times and situations? Julia sighed languidly. Firstly, I'm married. Fortunately, the responsibility for the financial maintenance of the family lies with the man, not the woman. Secondly, we are not in a hurry to have children. I believe that to give birth without a home, without a yard, terribly irresponsible. And thirdly, I'm going through such a period now. Do you think it's easy to work as a waitress on night shifts, to go out, to put up with the antics of customers? I need to recuperate, get my head round it. Margaret had a lot to say to her daughter-in-law, but she kept quiet for her son's sake. He was having a hard enough time as it was, and now he would be flitting between mother and wife, like between two fires. Margaret realized that her daughter-in-law was openly condemning her life. Julia thought it was irresponsible to have children without a home, without a yard. It's a reproach to her, isn't it? When she and Andrew had Oliver, the young family had no home of their own. That's what her daughter-in-law was implying. The longer the young people lived at Margaret's, the clearer the woman realized that Julia was manipulating Oliver, making him dance to her tune. She uses her spouse, her son, the one who is in love with the young beauty, to the point of losing his mind. The wife turns the situation in her favor. Julia herself clearly does not have any tender feelings for her husband. This is evident from her irritation, from the unpleasant looks at the spouse, from the words, gestures. There's a lot of signs of that, and how only the son does not notice. So why is Julia still with Oliver? The answer is simple. Who else would go to such lengths for her? Where else would she find someone so loyal and obedient? A feeling like Oliver's for Julia is rare, and the girl realizes that. She will try to squeeze the maximum out of the situation, and if there is a better option, she will easily leave Oliver. Being confident in her own attractiveness, Julia behaved rudely with her mother-in-law right in front of Oliver. She must have realized that Margaret could see right through her. It made her angry, annoyed, and frightened, apparently. And how did Julia look at her mother-in-law? She felt superfluous in her own home, the arrogant, contemptuous glance, the barbed remarks, the reproaches. In order to have less contact with her sister-in-law, Margaret herself now went to visit neighbors, and also often went to her sister Vanessa and even stayed overnight at her place. Vanessa, of course, advised her to put Julia in her place. This is your house. Her sister shook her head. Remind her of that. Make her think about it. Tell her to separate, to look for a place to live, because she's living on her own and she's being insolent. Well, do you want me to talk to her myself if you're uncomfortable? No, Margaret waved her hands. No way. Oliver is always on her side in everything. He was already having a hard enough time as it was, and he didn't want to add to it. Oliver really believed everything his wife said. Margaret tried to behave as politely as possible, kept silent in response to her daughter-in-law's barbed remarks, cleaned her plates without complaint, and put up with her reproaches. But Julia, apparently, still complained to her husband about his mother, put it in an unpleasant light. Mum, why are you picking on her? Sometimes the son would start a conversation. Julia is a wonderful woman. I love her. You mustn't think of her as an enemy. Try to make it up to her. I never quarreled with her. Margaret tried to justify herself. I try not to talk to her at all. She turns every conversation to her own side. She makes me her number one enemy. That's what it's all about. It's sad. Oliver shook his head. That's what Julia says. You either blame her, ignore her, or make her work in the kitchen. You can't have it both ways. Why do you make her clean up after herself? Julia's been going through a rough patch. She needs a break. I was just reminding her to put her plate away. No one's making her work. I'm serving you. Oliver looked at her mother with a sad look, and Margaret realized it was useless. He wouldn't believe that his wonderful Julia was systematically turning her husband and mother-in-law's life into a nightmare. Maybe it will come to Oliver at some point, but certainly not now. Julia masterfully pitted Oliver against his own mother, the person who sheltered the couple in her home, gave them shelter, who essentially feeds them. Oliver earned a pittance at the sawmill, and the lion's share of his salary went to pay off his loans. In the city, the couple had accumulated loans, for which they now had to pay. It was hurtful and painful. Margaret saw no way out of the situation. She could only hope that sooner or later Oliver would see the light. Sometimes she wanted to throw the insolent youth out of the house, but that would mean losing her son forever. Julia had a way of turning Oliver against his mother over nothing. And if she threw them out of the house at a difficult moment, there'd be drama to be played out. Shakespeare would be jealous, and the house, to be fair, it was Oliver's. When Margaret's mother died, she suddenly realized that these things usually happen suddenly. Yes, Mum had been ill, in need of help, but there was nothing to suggest that she'd passed away suddenly. Margaret thought about it a lot. After all, she might one day be gone just as suddenly. And then what would happen to Oliver? The inheritance, waiting 6 months. What if there's another bidder for the house? Unexpected heirs. My father had a complicated relationship with his relatives. Anything's possible. To protect Oliver, Margaret, who was the only owner of the house at the time, wrote a gift deed to her son. And that was it. Her soul was at rest. Margaret was used to living for her only child. She did everything for him. The house was now officially Oliver's, and his son knew it. The truth was, Oliver didn't think he'd need the inheritance. He planned to settle down in the city, buy a nice flat. What was he going to do with a country house? Who knew it would turn out like this? Margaret decided to be patient. It cost her a lot of effort to hold on and not to take it out on Julia. And it was not a healthy life for her. But for the sake of her son, she could bear it. As long as Oliver was happy. If it hadn't been for Vanessa and her sensible advice, Margaret would have spent all her savings on a flat in the city for young people. But her sister had been right. The woman realized that now more than ever. Julia doesn't love Oliver. That much is obvious. She's using him. And if Oliver buys a flat that would be considered jointly acquired property, the young wife will immediately demand a divorce. She'll legally take half of it with her into her new life. And that's a lot of good money. No, she won't, Julia. Oliver can't go on blinded by this strange love forever. He'll see the light one day. That's when he'll need a flat in the city for his new life. It's just a pity Oliver can't be kicked out of the house. Margaret had to endure the antics and unjust reproaches of her daughter-in-law. There was no end to it. But the woman realized that now she was unable to change anything. Vanessa, seeing her sister's distress, suggested that they go on holiday together. Why? To get away. She urged Margaret over the phone. We'll sunbathe on the sea, we'll swim, we'll go on excursions. It'll be great, agree. Margaret eventually gave in. She really needed a break from everything that was going on at home. Let the young people live in the village house by themselves. Julia would have to cook and clean. They're so spoiled they won't even wash a plate. She sits at home all day watching soap operas on her phone. Julia, of course, expressed her displeasure about Margaret's holiday. There's no money in the family. And some people go to resorts, she replied to Oliver's remark that his salary had been cut again. But then even the man who had angelic patience and was in love with his wife couldn't stand it. Julia, what do you care? Mum earned it. She's entitled to it. Yes, and what about my holiday? We've never been anywhere with you before. And we'll earn it, I promise. Margaret disappeared into her room without saying anything. She had no time to get into an argument with her sister-in-law. Things wouldn't pack themselves. It had been a marvelous trip. Margaret and Vanessa rented a cottage in a small village on the Black Sea. The sisters walked a lot, swam in the warm waves, sunbathed, went on a variety of excursions. Margaret once took a risk and realized an old dream, took a ride on a jet ski with a young and reckless driver. Splashing in the face, dizzying speed, endless sea surface. Margaret had never had so much fun and fear at the same time. What about the sea? Excursions. The sisters even went to discos at night and danced like in their youth. Don't despair. Thank you, Vanessa, for pulling me out. Margaret was genuinely pleased. It felt like 10 years younger. By the way, that's exactly what it looks like, Vanessa smiled. You look better, more rested. You look wonderful. And so it was. For the first time in years, Margaret liked herself. She looked fresher in the mirror, and most importantly, there was a sparkle in her eyes and life and energy in her face. Margaret felt that she had left behind all her problems, her capricious, demanding daughter-in-law, her unsettled son, her endless quarrels in the kitchen. There was a powerful reset. The woman felt strong, beautiful, and energetic. The world seemed bright and friendly. Only good things were thought of. One day the sisters stayed up late, admiring unusually large stars and bright yellow moon, which left a clear path on the sea surface. It was beautiful, Margaret said. It sure is. Vanessa agreed. It's a pity we have to go back tomorrow. I can't believe it. I like it so much here, another life, another world. And there it's all the same again. They're chasing them away. Vanessa couldn't take it anymore. They're sitting on your neck and being rude. When she waits for me, I'll come to you and put things in order. Don't. Margaret protested. It would make things worse. It won't make things worse, Vanessa grumbled. It can't get any worse than this. Good evening, fair ladies. A low, pleasant voice came from somewhere behind them. Both women flinched in surprise and turned round. In front of them stood a man, slim, trim, with elegant gray hair on his temples. He smiled charmingly and very friendly. He was wearing jeans rolled up to his knees and a loose black t-shirt. In all this, the stranger looked very stylish and attractive. Hello to you, too, Vanessa answered for the two of them. It's a lovely evening, isn't it? The man kept coming closer and closer. Margaret couldn't take her eyes off his smile. It made the stranger's face glow from within. The man introduced himself as Harry, said he had just arrived here today and checked into a room on the first floor of the cafe. The sisters were just there tonight having dinner at the place, drinking wine, eating kebab, enjoying live music. Harry immediately noticed two beautiful single ladies at the table and purposely followed them to the shore. I'm sorry if I startled you, he said. And don't think I'm a frivolous adventurer. It's just that you both have such kind smiles. I wanted to get to know you better. I'm here all by myself. I'd like to find some company for walking and socializing if you don't mind. There's a problem with that, Vanessa shrugged her shoulders guiltily. We're leaving tomorrow at lunchtime, the plane. That's a shame. The smile slipped off Harry's face for a moment. Margaret, too, was sorry that they wouldn't get to know the man better. Surely it would have been even more fun and interesting for the three of them to spend the holiday together. There was something about Harry, something special. Margaret wanted to be near him, to look into his eyes, to admire the man's smile, to listen to him. Strange. The woman didn't remember anything like that happening to her in the last 30 years. And had it ever happened in her life at all? Well, if that's the case, we have one night left, Harry smiled again. Let's make it fun, something to remember. I come here a lot. I'll show you such places. I'll show you places like this. Are you coming with me? Margaret was ready to say yes immediately. But Vanessa, cautious Vanessa, unlike her sister, did not lose her head around the charming stranger. We're kind of seeing you for the first time, she said with an embarrassed smile. I do not want to offend you, but still. Harry slapped himself on the forehead. Of course, of course. There are all sorts of freaks and criminals out there now. Of course you're afraid I'm like that, aren't you? Let's just walk along the seafront then. There are lots of people here. I don't want to leave you. We can do that, Vanessa said cheerfully. Margaret could see that her sister was glad that Harry wasn't offended. It was a wonderful walk. The sisters and their new acquaintance chatted and laughed non-stop. It turned out that Harry lives in New York. He has his own business there, a chain of shops in California. He is often there on business, meeting with winemakers, signing contracts, making purchases, in general, developing the business. Harry also told about his personal life simply, without secrecy. He acted as if he had known Vanessa and Margaret for 100 years. I was widowed early, he said. My daughter was only 9 at the time. I never remarried because my daughter didn't want a stepmother in the house. And the word of an only child has always been law to Harry. You and Margaret are alike in that, Vanessa said. She lives only with her son too, and she puts up with a lot for his sake, allows him everything. Yes, Harry looked at Margaret with interest and met her eyes. The woman's eyes flashed like they had when she was young. She even felt hot. That's a waste, Harry continued. Years later, I realized it wasn't right. My daughter grew up to be a spoilt brat, but she's doing well now. She's found a husband who tolerates her whims as well as I do, and they live peacefully. Abroad, unfortunately. They've gone to a warm place. So I'm all alone. I have a job, friends. But still, after my daughter's departure, the house and my soul feel empty. The Trinity partied till the morning. It felt like they were back in their youth. Harry was clearly sympathetic to Margaret. He tried to make her like him. From time to time, he took her hand as if by accident. And once he gave her a gentle, brief hug around the waist. But Margaret wanted that moment to last forever. The sisters didn't get to their cottage until it was starting to get light. Harry, of course, volunteered to escort them. I hate to leave you, he said, looking at Margaret. Margaret, do you two want to exchange phone numbers? Vanessa suggested. What if we had such a good time? Maybe we could come back again next year. We should call each other so we can have a holiday together. That'd be great. That's a great idea, Harry said, dictating his number. No. Give me your phone number, Harry suggested. Margaret complied with his request with a smile. He deliberately held her hand in his as he took her mobile phone. There was so much warmth from him, so much tenderness. Margaret wanted to dissolve into it all. It was a shame they had met so late. Harry quickly dialed Margaret's number from his phone. There he smiled. Now that we've exchanged numbers, we won't lose each other. That's great. Margaret nodded. She realized that this phone exchange meant nothing, and the fairy tale that had almost begun would never really begin, because there was no tomorrow. Tonight she and Vanessa would fly home, and there would be a cramped village house, a disgruntled daughter-in-law, a disengaged son. And the problems hadn't gone anywhere while she'd been away. Harry, Margaret thought. Well, Harry, today he walked with us. Tomorrow he'll find someone else. Such a man, he's not for me. He's too handsome, too successful, too wonderful. I can't have a man like that. It's sad, of course, but it's the truth of life. And how did he look at you? Vanessa smiled when the sisters were alone. I wish someone would look at me with admiration someday, just once. Come on, Margaret said with a smile. She knew she would think of Harry often now, his soft voice, his delightful manners, his beautiful eyes. And let that man forget about her the very next day. It would make no difference. Margaret did not reach her home until evening. She and Vanessa had had a couple of hours' nap before the flight. But still Margaret felt tired and broken after the sleepless night, the flight, and the acclimatization. The gate was unlocked. Oliver must have forgotten to lock the gate when he got home from work. Oh, he's been tired lately, Margaret thought. And then Julia doesn't know what she's been feeding her husband while I've been away. It was hard to imagine Julia cooking borscht for her husband. The windows of the house were wide open. From inside, the television was blaring the evening news. Margaret was about to enter the house with a smile when she heard Julia's voice. She was obviously in the kitchen. How? She was reprimanding someone, obviously Oliver. Very simple. She'll be here in a minute. So what? We won't send her to Maggie's for milk. And while she's walking around, we'll put her stuff outside. It's a piece of cake. It's been agreed 100 times, Julia argued. What are you worried about? Isn't that too harsh? Oliver asked in an uncertain voice. She's my mother after all, and this is her house. It's not hers. It's yours, Julia argued. You showed me the deed of gift. If that's the case, why should I put up with her here? I mean, she's been bugging me about this and that. Oliver, I told you she's trying to break us up. But then I'll leave. Because I can't live in a house with my mother. Okay, Oliver mumbled conciliatorily. We'll proceed as we agreed. Just don't let it get to you. We're doing the right thing, standing up for our personal boundaries. We're doing good. Margaret stood under the window, dead or alive. The meaning of the conversation she'd just overheard slowly dawned on her. They were going to kick her out of the house, and Oliver had agreed to that. This was something the older woman had never expected. Her eyes flickered darkly. Her blood pressure must have spiked. Margaret took a few deep breaths to get herself under control, let the joyful look pass, and entered the native hay. "Oh, hello," said Julia, smiling lusciously. "And we were expecting you a little later." "I was in a taxi," Margaret replied. "I didn't have time to look round, and that's why." "Julia, I've brought you some presents," she continued. "Oh, what a lot of impressions. I'll share them. I'll tell you about them." Julia pretended to be happy to see him. Oliver stood by her side, slumped and silent. Margaret understood the reason for her son's sadness. Of course he was having a hard time, but he could not put his wife in her place. She has too much influence over him. "Oh, Margaret," said Julia, "will you go to Maggie's and get some fresh milk, please? I've got soup boiling on the cooker." "I can't get away. Oliver's very tired from work and he's ill." "If you're not too tired, of course, of course." Margaret nodded and left the house, already knowing what awaited her on her return. It was good that she had listened to this conversation. At least she would have time to prepare for a serious conversation with her son and his wife. Margaret noticed her suitcases on the porch from a distance. They stood orphaned, leaning against the wall, waiting for their hostess. The hope that Oliver would stop the brazen wife had vanished like smoke. The woman went up to the porch and knocked on the door. "There's a note," Julia's voice came from inside. "Read it, and you'll understand. Goodbye." "I don't want your note," said Margaret. "I want to talk to you, to look you in the eye." "Oh, eyes." The door swung open with a clatter. Julia stood on the threshold. She looked haughtily at Margaret. "Well, will you look, if that's what you want?" "Julia, why have you done this to me?" Margaret asked. "I've tried to be your friend, hadn't I?" "You're annoying me," the young woman shared. "You look judgmental. Everything is wrong. Everything is wrong for you. You make your own rules. I don't feel like I own the place, and Oliver's being nice to you." "But this is my house," Margaret reminded me gently. "So it's only natural that I should have my own ways." "There you go again," Julia exclaimed. "Are you insinuating that we live here again? It's not your house, by the way. It's not yours, it's your son's. So you're the one living here. Then get out of here. Your pension is good. Enough for a rented place." "Thank you for packing my things," Margaret said calmly. And it took a lot of effort for Margaret to keep calm. She would indeed cry bitterly when she got to Vanessa. Of course she would go to her sister. Who else would she go to? Except she doesn't have much stuff. "My things are just clothes," Margaret sighed heavily. "Where are the photo albums, the old books, the letters?" "And this rubbish?" Julia grinned. "We threw it away." "How?" Margaret gasped. She felt as if she'd been punched in the solar plexus. "It was my family history. Old photographs, letters from Andrew and my parents, postcards, diaries Vanessa and I kept when we were young. Ellie and Oliver's first drawings. All of it carefully stored in boxes and folders, neatly arranged on the shelves of a rack in my bedroom. Was there nothing left?" Julia looked at her mother-in-law defiantly. "What's with the habit of clinging to rubbish?" Grinned the insolent girl. "What's the use of these dusty papers? It's even easier to breathe without them." Margaret, in spite of her condition, suddenly had a marvelous idea. The woman even had to suppress a smile so as not to accidentally give herself away. Julia. She would soon stop feeling like the mistress of the situation. In a couple of minutes, the smug expression will evaporate from her pretty face, Margaret thought. "So you've thrown everything out of my room?" she asked. "Absolutely," Julia replied. "It's going to be our dressing room now. All the boxes, every single one of them. Have you even looked inside? Some we looked at, some we threw away." "Why?" Julia was suddenly tense. Were there documents or what? "D-dots can be recovered in a pinch," Margaret said, sinking tiredly onto the porch steps. "Was the blue shoebox thrown away too?" "Yeah, I guess so. What's the big deal?" Because Margaret looked up at Julia. "It was my savings. the money for the flat I was going to give Oliver. The words had an incredible effect. Julia was stunned, pale. She opened and closed her mouth a couple of times, trying to say something. Then she sank helplessly to the steps beside Margaret. "Why didn't you tell me?" she almost whispered. Margaret was pleased with the effect of the phrase. She did not keep any money in any blue shoebox. It was just sitting there in the account, slowly building up. But Julia needed to be taught a lesson for all the bad things she'd done to her and Oliver. "How did I know you'd decide to throw my things out of the house?" Margaret said, stubbornly playing the part of a confused, bewildered old woman. "I never imagined such a thing." Julia shook her head as if she had woken from a dream. Her eyes lit up with eagerness for action. "You will tell me everything in detail," she asked. "What did the box look like? What shade of blue was it? Was it large or small?" Margaret answered, trying not to confuse her statements, lest the situation get out of hand. Oliver had stayed home the whole time. Didn't even stick his nose out on the porch. He was probably ashamed that he'd gone along with his wife and kicked his mother out of the house. But he couldn't turn against his wife either. He loved her too much, which Julia took advantage of. Having answered all Julia's questions, Margaret headed for the bus stop. "Come on," Stay, her daughter-in-law said. She needed her mother-in-law now to help her in her search. The young woman was determined to find the box, even in a landfill, even at the end of the world, and Margaret could help her. She knew what the receptacle of a large sum of money looked like. Why should she? Margaret was a little surprised. How so? Why should we look for the box of money together? You do care about your savings, don't you? That's what it is. Margaret smiled. That's where you're wrong. I don't care what happens to that money. I was going to give it to you anyway. If you find it, take it. Margaret walked down her home street and felt Julia's eyes on her. Her sister-in-law was shocked that she had thrown away so much money with her own hands. Yes, but now Julia would dig her nose into the ground to bring that wealth home. Greedy Julia doesn't realize Margaret's money is in a bank account. Her mother-in-law is not so inexperienced as to keep such funds in a box. Before heading to the bus stop, Margaret stopped by to see Jen, a neighbor. She had once been friends with her mother Maggie, a firm friendship, but now Maggie was sadly no longer alive. Margaret still had a good relationship with Jen, though. She needed someone in the village, someone to tell her what was going on, to keep an eye on Julia. And Jen was the perfect person to be that informant. The woman had been exasperated at first, listening to Margaret's story. She couldn't understand how it was possible to do that to a man who let his daughter-in-law and son into the house when they were in a difficult situation. And then, having learnt the full story, Jen laughed loudly and merrily. "Oh, Aunt Margaret, you've got to be kidding. You should have rubbed her nose in it like that. You've got that right, haven't you?" "I'd like to know how they're doing," Margaret smiled. "How are they living? How's the search going? Something tells me this story will open Oliver's eyes to his wife." "That's too bad," Jen shook her head. "I didn't think he'd be so weak-willed." "Love is evil," Margaret sighed. Jen had hit a sore spot in her heart. "Of course I've been looking after them, and I've kept my son involved. Do you know how quick he is? Peckinpah." Jen's son had just turned 14. He's been using his phone to film content for his channel. And once again, he's got a few things to go on. When Margaret was done with her chores, she went to see her sister Vanessa. She would not abandon her, would listen to her, support her, pity her. It was good to have such a person. A fortnight had passed since the evening of Margaret's return from the resort. It was a short time, but a lot had happened in that time. Firstly, Margaret's plan had worked. Julia was hooked. She found out where the rubbish from their village was taken, found the dump, and now she traveled there every day as if it were her job. Thankfully, the girl didn't work anywhere and had plenty of free time. Julia's trips to the dump were regularly reported to Margaret by phone by Jen. She proved to be an excellent liaison. "Oh, Aunt Margaret, what a circus. She goes to the bus stop first thing in the morning like a bayonet. She's like a tourist. She's got a huge rucksack on her shoulders, overalls, gloves, bags. Everything is serious. And in the evening she comes back tired, upset, angry. She smells like a motherfucker. Animals scatter. People cringe. What a circus. The stories of Julia's hikes were not the only ones. Pekin, Jen's son, sometimes followed Julia, traveling with the boys to the dumps and filming videos of the young woman's persistent digging through mountains of rubbish. Margaret watched these videos on Pekin's channel. Julia scrupulously, day after day, combed through the dump, not missing a single square meter. It looked comical, of course. But Margaret was already feeling a little sorry for her sister-in-law, almost ex-sister-in-law. Oliver had filed for divorce. First, Margaret had heard from the neighbors that Oliver had left home. Then the son called his mother, apologized, repented, and told her he was divorcing Julia. She had turned me away with her obsession with money, her boorishness, her greed. We're splitting up, Mum. I can't go on with her. She must be crazy. Julia can stay at our house for a while. I've given her a week because she has nowhere to go. Julia keeps hoping to find money. It's become an obsession for her. She blames herself for not looking in the boxes you threw out, and she's eating herself up. She blames me too. It's unbearable. What about you? What are you going to do in town? I found a job, a good job at last, with accommodation, which is important. I'll have to go on business trips, but what's in it for me? But the money's good. Margaret felt better after talking to her son. It was so important to be in touch with the person she loved. There was no more conflict or misunderstanding between her and Oliver. Oliver's life seemed to be getting better. He's found a job, he's getting away from Julia, who was openly using him. Maybe he'll meet a nice girl soon and be happy in his personal life again. What are his years? The relationship with Julia is clearly a lesson to Oliver. He won't fall into that kind of net again. At least Margaret hoped so. The nicest thing that had happened in Margaret's life was the day after she'd arrived at her sister's house. Vanessa, of course, had taken her in. They had a spare room in their flat. "Live as long as you like, sis," she hugged Margaret. "I'd be glad if you moved in for good." Margaret went to bed upset. She had no idea how she was going to live her life. In the morning, she received a phone call from Harry, the same casual acquaintance who had charmed the woman at the resort. He said he couldn't forget their meeting, that he thought of Margaret all the time, dreamed of seeing her again. It was incredible. Harry. Margaret had never thought that such a man would actually fall in love with her, but it seemed that he had. Harry called and wrote often. They chatted a lot, and gradually, somehow, they became closer to each other. At a distance, yes, but still Margaret felt that they both needed this companionship. Harry expressed a desire to come to Margaret, but she suggested another option, a more pleasant one. Margaret would fly to him herself, because, well, the atmosphere of a resort and a dusty old country town were, as they say, two big differences. The money Margaret had for the trip was the very money she had once saved for her son's flat. Oliver earns his own money, but she, Margaret, has only one life, and she should enjoy every moment of it. The woman realized this in her retirement, but better late than never. In general, Margaret was going on a long journey, went shopping with Vanessa, bought beautiful things, and felt really happy. She had one more unpleasant but urgent thing to do before she left. A conversation with Julia. She's had enough of being a loser, Margaret thought. Let her start a new life too. "I guess Ben is going to propose today," thought Kate, and stretching with pleasure, she rolled over on her stomach and raked the pillow that still held the scent of her departed lover and buried her face in it. She knew she was so lucky. And how could she not be happy when your boyfriend was a handsome sheriff's brother who promised to fulfill the dream of American life for you in a house in a respectable suburb behind a white picket fence with 3 kids and maybe a pet Saint Bernard? Ben had promised that everything would happen. He would soon save enough for them to move into their new and shared home. Her parents, Kate thought lazily, had never dreamed of such a thing at her age. They, who had won a green card in the 90s, had come to the United States with literally 2 suitcases and high hopes instead of seed money. A math teacher and an engineer, they were willing to work hard and stubbornly pursue their goals. But it wasn't that simple. 3 times Anastasia and Vincent found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy. They had to live in a trailer park eating out of a food bank. They had to humiliate themselves and take things from charity funds for their daughters. His mom still never tired of repeating how much it hurt her and her father's pride, but they survived. They rose to a confident middle class and now lived on the West Coast in a small house on the coast. Memories of her sister came to mind acutely, suddenly, and at the same time. So naturally, Kate sat up on the bed and shook her head, groaning unhappily. All right, that's enough. On this wonderful morning, she would not think about the past. Enough. But the past, no matter how hard she tried to run away from it, didn't want to let go. And it hurt Kate to imagine what her parents were still feeling, because losing a daughter was, of course, a much more horrible experience than losing a sister. Maggie's been missing for 5 years, missing under circumstances that simply did not allow for hope that one day she would be found alive. And yet, Kate and the girl's parents believed, desperately, with anticipation in every moment for the first 2, with a wistful hope that there was room for happy miracles in the world the next year. In the 4th year, their faith was based on guilt, that they, as kinfolk, simply had no moral right to think Maggie dead until the body was. And then, as the 5th year went on, everyone realized it was time to come to terms. Maggie, their bright, kind, pure girl, was just gone. It was as if she'd been cut out of the world, removed, and that was the end of it. Okay, that's enough. Feeling like she was going to burst into tears if she continued to lie like this, Kate hurried out of bed. Tuck her in. Ben is accustomed to strict order. In fact, he had a thing about keeping everything on a ruler and neat and tidy to the max. It wasn't that Kate had been bothered by it, but now, of course, she was thinking that when she became Miss Kane, she would have to work hard to keep the house in order. What order? Even Ben's cans of beans and other canned goods in the kitchen cupboards had to be labeled in the same direction. Matthew, Ben's brother, had once delicately hinted to Kate that this was not a mental disorder, but rather a psychological problem that a 30-year-old forehead had no reason to fight. I won't, Kate replied cheerfully. I'm not without sin myself, she added with a smile, and Matthew grinned back and nodded. He knew that Kate was hysterical about snakes, hated clowns, and could change her clothes 10 times to choose what to wear because she was in one outfit or the other, but she thought she had a bad figure. It hadn't gotten to the point of moving in with Ben, so Kate had to make do with the clothes she'd picked out of what she'd hastily thrown into a small bag, and she'd chosen a denim skirt and a pink t-shirt with a picture of a unicorn chewing gum. It was probably 30 degrees outside. She thought unhappily as she opened the windows in the living room and kitchen for air. She decided to do a big cleanup. No, Ben hadn't asked her to do that, but she decided to surprise her lover by showing him what a hostess she was. Ben had said yesterday that he was going to the supermarket for his monthly big shopping spree, but when he got back, they'd have half a day free. Perhaps, thought Kate, sweeping the kitchen floor, they could cook dinner together. That would be so romantic, something Italian. Seafood pasta, perhaps. Mrs. Kane, Kate said aloud, as if tasting her future last name, plumping up the decorative sofa cushions in the living room. She took a keen look at her surroundings. No, he was a good guy, a clean and orderly man, albeit a little manic, but it would be to her advantage as a hostess in the future. And then Kate remembered what Ben had said about taking down the guest room closet. He didn't get many guests, so he used it almost as a storage room, for example, for his inflatable boat and what was going on in the closet. There were boxes of old high school and college awards, more old photo albums, and I don't think there were even boxes from some moving day that hadn't been thrown away. Ben had bought this house 5 years ago, and before that, he'd lived in rentals. Anyway, Ben had said he was going to clean out the closet because he couldn't get enough of this mess, but he'd never gotten around to it. And Kate could imagine what a constant, so to speak, background torment it was for someone like Ben. Wow, Kate said, opening the doors of the massive, obviously antique closet in the guest room. You could set up store on the couch in here. Ben had said it was time to give the old stuff to charity, and Kate, sneezing a couple of times from the dust, began unloading winter and denim jackets, hiking boots, board games, some old vases. Just think. And a bunch of all this stuff Ben had had to carry with him when he moved away from his parents. He told her once that his mom wouldn't let him go anywhere without all those important things she thought he'd need someday. And if we have a garage sale, we'll be millionaires. Kate giggled, looking at the pile of stuff on the floor. Now it all had to be sorted. just sorted neatly into categories and then let Ben decide where to put it. But before that, she decided to wipe the inside of the closet clean of dust. Done and done. Armed with a rag, she began to rub the crossbar, shelves, side and back walls, and ouch, Kate exclaimed when the back wall crunched at one point under the pressure of her hand, shifting sideways. Kate was afraid she'd broken something. Not that Ben wouldn't forgive, he would understand. He'd been so clumsy himself at times. Just last week, he knocked over a mug of coffee on his brand new laptop. The previous laptop, by the way, ended its life in the same way. And for such clumsy adventures, by the way, coupled with his tall stature, Ben got the nickname Moose in high school. His brother Matt had given him that nickname, by the way, when he came to visit. Kate gingerly touched the wall again, checking to see if anything was broken. Suddenly, the wall slid away smoothly, like a closet door, and behind it there was a dark opening. Catherine frowned. What was it? Some kind of hiding place? She stepped right into the closet and looked inside. There was not much light, but it was clear that it was a tiny pantry. She fumbled with her hand on the wall. Was there a switch of some kind? And a moment later, a light bulb flashed under the stream. Kate blinked. It was indeed a pantry, but an unusual one. Later, there was a table and a chair. On the walls hung maps and some photos. Photos of many people, streets, houses, cars. Catherine frowned. What is this? There was also a rack filled with boxes and individual things, a balloon with artificial snow, a teddy bear, a statue of a reindeer, and there was also a rack with things on hangers. Catherine shook her head and frowned harder. Why make a closet behind a closet? Ben was certainly a weird guy, but this was too much even for him. And why did she feel so uncomfortable in this place? It was as if she'd invaded something that wasn't meant for her and generally prying eyes. And why did it suddenly feel so creepy in here? The girl realized that she was reminded of such maps with photos on the walls, marked with multicolored buttons, and in some places connected by threads. She had seen such things in movies and TV series of detectives. Yeah, her consciousness told her a maniac might have one of these in his lair. But Ben is certainly not a maniac. Kate resented her own thoughts. Why would she even think such a stupid thing? Maybe, well, it's just a hobby of his. Strange like the rest of him, and she'd better get out of here and spend the day as if nothing had happened, in the company of her favorite man. And then, if she had the chance, ask him, honey, I found something curious there. Tell me what is it and why. Aha mentally grinned that suspicious part of Catherine's mind which she had already made trouble more than once in her life. And then Ben would close his strong arms around her neck and bury her curious in the past. But now, breathless carcass in the backyard. All right, that's enough. It seemed to Kate that the closet was getting very stuffy, and she turned around and wanted to get out, but her eyes caught the things on the hangers and she froze, slowly and heavily, as in a nightmare when you move and your limbs feel like they're stuck in thickened air. She approached the hanger and pulled one of the things. It was a scarlet silk dress with large white polka dots, a flying silhouette. It looked like it had come out of a fashion catalog from the early 50s. No, it couldn't be her. Kate's brain seemed to desperately refuse to believe what her eyes were seeing. The same dress. No, it couldn't be the same dress. It's just similar. But her hands were already reaching out to check the hem, and there were the initials MP embroidered there. Kate's knees trembled, her mouth opened, but she made no sound. Her sister had a habit of embroidering her initials on things in her closet. How much she had joked about this silly habit of hers and asked why. Why do people sign books in their home library? Maggie answered. So the clothes become all mine. 5 years ago, Maggie disappeared, and people who last saw her said she was wearing this very dress. Her favorite. Catherine's fingers frantically fumbled with the delicate silk, as if it could all dissolve, disappear, revealing only a deception, an illusion. Because to believe it was too frightening, too incomprehensible, too confusing, too crazy. And then Kate suddenly noticed a hole on the side of the dress, at waist level from the back. Here it was torn, and here it was stained with something. She brought the material closer to her eyes and shrieked softly, strangled, brown color, as if dried blood. Honey, I'm back. Ben's voice came from far away, as if from another world. Honey was quick to put the dress back on the rack, leaping out of the closet, sliding the false wall door back into place. Kate frantically started throwing things back into the closet. Hurry, but in time. Hi, Ben stood on the threshold of the room, looking surprised. What are you doing, sweetheart? I'm just Tate faked a smile and hoped he didn't see it as the shocked falseness of a man who'd learned too much. I thought I'd help you sort things out. You talk to me. Remember that you wanted to clean this place up. I remember, Ben grinned. But you shouldn't have done that. There's so much junk in here, you don't want to waste a nice day like this. But I appreciated it. Come here, baby, he beckoned to her. I stopped at the bakery and picked up some of your favorite raisin buns. Great, Kate squeaked and followed. In the kitchen, she didn't know how. But she made coffee for herself and Ben, her hands shaking a little, but he didn't seem to notice. Kate devoured the muffin, as if she'd been starving for 3 days. I love it when girls have good appetites. Ben winked at her and Kate almost choked. No, it was a great compliment, of course, because then you wouldn't expect your boyfriend to take you to the gym one day and put you on green smoothies to lose weight. But Maggie had the best appetite of the two sisters, and her parents had even told her off more than once for being so pudgy at 17. But Kate thought it looked great on her. Ben was talking about something, about how he and the boys had gotten a barn from a farmer who was a co-founder of a small construction company. How old Stu had gotten his hound line pregnant again, and now he was running around fostering puppies. And the local vet was scolding him again for being irresponsible because he should have spayed her in time. Maybe. Is everything all right? Ben touched her arm affectionately, and Kate shuddered, jumping up in her chair. I'm sorry, Ben sighed. You don't seem like yourself today. No, it's okay. Kate assured him with more fervor than she should for natural behavior. I just had a bad dream. Nightmares from the past. Kate went to the sink to rinse the dishes. In fact, she dreamed a wonderful dream. How she and Ben came to visit her parents, and she had 3 children, and everyone had a picnic on the beach, and Maggie was with them. Alive and well, and apparently sensing her mood, though he misinterpreted her tense reticence, didn't inquire further and instead talked about what they should do today. At the same time, the couple sorted through the rest of the shopping they'd brought from the supermarket. What needed to be frozen. Ben put away in the fridge at once. And Kate, casting glances at Ben, thought about one thing. How well did she know the man? Or it would be more accurate to say, how well does she think she knows him? Ben Kane, 29 years old, born in Idaho and moved here to New York State right after he graduated from high school. Moved here to be closer to Matthew, who, by the way, is his half-brother on his father's side and with whom Ben has never hidden it. He has always gotten along better than with his parents, and deliberately didn't go to college. Although, according to Matthew, he had a chance, especially if he had gotten a sports scholarship. But Ben, from the age of 12, as they call it, burned to work with wood and, as a result, made a hobby a profitable business. Ben was never married or engaged, and how many girls he had before her, Catherine did not know and did not want to know. But she could guess. A brutal lot. Because Ben, although Ben could seem at first impression of a guy modest, shy, a kind of provincial simpleton, in fact, possessed stunning charisma and some just animal magnetism, thanks to which after about 5 minutes of acquaintance people were ready to talk to him on the heart and generally believe, it seems, in everything he says. So they met in the city of Chicago, where Ben came to some important exhibition of construction devices, and Kate worked in a coffee shop there. Actually, she graduated from college as an advertising specialist. She should have been sitting in an office, but somehow they haven't hired her yet. Why? Well, this was such a mini black streak for a young graduate with no work experience, and she had to live on something, so she became a waitress. Salary with tips was just enough to rent an apartment in a remote area of the city and eat burgers and noodles from Chinatown. Fancy clothes, beauty parlors, Fridays at the clubs, and all that good stuff. Forget it, miss. This place was all about surviving, because it would be unthinkable to drop everything and go to my parents. Not that they wouldn't accept a daughter who'd run aground in life. But Kate didn't want to disappoint them more than anything else by turning up on their doorstep a loser for nothing. They'd had enough of one disappointment in their lives. Her sister. That's why Kate never considered her parents' house on the coast as her own. And even when they, selling their common house, in which they raised their daughters, offered Kate her share to give cash, she courageously refused these tens of thousands. And the parents, by the way, although they hid it, but it felt, were glad, and Catherine was glad for them. They are, if you look in the conventional sense, their duty to fulfill the parental duty. Raise their daughters, and then, well, it was time for each of them to go to an independent adult life. and how bitter it was to realize, despite the past years, that Maggie had not had time to fly fully into this adult life from her parents' nest. It was bitter to realize it until this morning. And now Catherine had fear sitting in her chest as if embodied in a piece of ice with sharp edges. Maggie's dress. In Ben's secret storeroom. How did it get there? Hey, baby girl. Ben loomed over his fiancée and reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. So what's wrong? You don't seem the same. Well, it's just... Kate smiled softly and pressed herself against him, rubbing her forehead against his muscular chest, her head barely reaching his armpits, hiding her face because it seemed that he could read everything on it. Sorry, I'm just tired at work, and lived outside the city and farther away from the usual Chicago suburbs. In fact, it was already on the outskirts of one other small town that wasn't far from the countryside. And this was where Kate had come for the weekend for the umpteenth time. I got a call from work saying I had to come back right away. The coffee machine was acting up and we bought a new one, some kind of Japanese wonder. Kate's lies came out of her mouth like hail from a weather cloud. And there's a trainee, and they say they have to fire him because he's a total slacker. They're going to hire a new one, and he has to be trained. And I'm already, an old-timer there anyway. It looks like I'll have to leave today. When she had finished, Catherine looked up at her man. Liar, Ben smiled, and his palms pressed her face against her cheeks, then smoothly and inexorably down to her neck. You're such a liar. Did you think I wouldn't find out you were climbing where you couldn't? Well, that's it, sweetheart. Now you'll know how I punish naughty girls. Your sister was just like that. You want to know what I did to her? Hey, baby. Ben's finger snapped in front of her nose and Kate blinked confusedly. She'd imagined the nightmare scene so vividly that she'd lost touch with reality. Sleeping on the move again. You're obviously overworking in this coffee shop. Ben smiled warmly. Her native, cozy and kind giant named Ben had no idea what she had done, and Kate suddenly felt so guilty for her horrible fantasies. Yes, he had her missing sister's dress hanging in his closet, but there had to be some logical explanation for it. Oh, how she wanted to burst into tears and just ask Ben to explain, that he would tell her the truth, and everything would be fine again, like a year ago, like a month ago, like this early morning. But instead, Kate nodded and promised to take more care of herself. And then she went and gathered her things and left the house and got into Ben's pickup truck. He drove her to her small town station as usual, from where the bus she needed was due to leave in the afternoon. And when Catherine left, Ben looked at the bus for a long time. And then he decided that since he had come to town again, it would be good to visit his brother, and since his girlfriend had left, maybe he should sit down with his brother in the evening, have a glass of lemonade because they were both sober, and talk about when Matthew would decide to build his own house. After all, his wife was 4 months pregnant. If they started now, they could probably finish the house before the baby was born. No, Ben did not understand his brother, who was comfortable living in rented accommodation. But Matthew had always been stubborn, and he could only hope that his wife, Sarah, would talk some sense into him. Matthew accepted the invitation and added that in such an evening, it was necessary to have a good time, especially since his wife was visiting her parents at the ranch, which meant that he would be bored at home alone. The sky gradually lost the colors of the sunset, replaced by inky blackness. And now it seemed that from here, from the back porch of Ben's house, you can observe all the stars of the universe. The brothers talked about building a house, and yes, Matthew said he didn't mind, but he couldn't stand the rush. And first he and Sarah had to figure out what they wanted. What kind of layout they wanted. How many stories and the location mattered. Sarah loved to garden, so the plot had to be chosen carefully. Well, you'll know by your 50th wedding anniversary, Ben grinned, and then choked on his lemonade as his brother elbowed him in the ribs for joking. When do we expect your first anniversary? I don't know, Ben sighed. You know, I've been asking her that for a long time, but I'm afraid I'll scare her off. You know, modern girls are very independent, and she hasn't even started her career yet. Maybe she wants too much. Ben squinted. Well, in principle, I advised her that despite all those excellent grades at uni, it would be better not to be shy to start small, and they'll give her a chance to prove herself. But I'm afraid she doesn't realize that it's not so easy to get a good position right away. Yes, Matthew shook his head. You've always had a knack for picking the difficult girls. And this one. He stopped talking, taking a sip of lemonade. You mean that she's her sister? Ben broke the silence. Matthew nodded instead of answering. He knew all about it. He'd known from the beginning. And it wasn't to say he hadn't tried to stop Ben. He had, but then kinship brotherhood had taken over. And from then on, Matthew wanted nothing more than to keep Ben's secret life from getting so that no one would find out and that he keep himself in line sometimes. Because let's face it, in recent years, it's become downright dangerous. Sometimes I wonder, Ben fidgeted on the porch. Would she understand if I told her everything? Don't even think about it. Matthew put his hand on Ben's shoulder and squeezed his fingers lightly but firmly. I'm sorry, there are too many people involved in this already. No, and no, believe me. Some secrets are best never told. I get it, Ben said, his head down. It's just that sometimes it's like I feel lonely. Believe me, it's better that way than, Matthew waved his hand uncertainly in the air. Sometimes I wish I could lock you up. Because, Ben, you're almost 30. Some things, are only good when you're young, when your blood is running wild, and all that fire and foolishness is getting in the way. Anyway, do you promise me that you're in control, that you won't say anything to her? I promise, Ben smiled broadly. Relax, will you? I realize that Kate is a very nice person, but she's not the kind of person I'd tell about what happened to her sister. Not now, that's for sure. I agree. Matthew sighed contentedly, uncorking a new bottle of lemonade. Otherwise, we'd have to kill her. Back in Chicago, Kate, of course, didn't go to the coffee shop and instead got to her apartment as soon as possible. And there, barely crossing the threshold, powerlessly sank to the floor and covered her face with her hands, silently sobbed. She was trembling nervously. She could hardly feel her body, and the world around her seemed little No, and no again. This couldn't be true. Her Ben could not be the monster who had taken Maggie's life, who had ripped the most precious thing from their family. However, how else was one to understand the fact that it burst like a burst bubble in a swamp where rotten air lurked, that he kept her sister's dress, tattered and with red-brown marks. Having roared to the point of hiccuping, Catherine scraped herself off the floor and went to the bathroom, where she splashed ice water in her face for a long time, and then, having taken off her shoes, collapsed on the bed and fell into a heavy sleep. And it was no ordinary dream, and not a fantastic sort of nightmare. It was a dream memory of the time before everything had happened, of the shaky time when their family had been together and happy, or as if happy. You're crazy. Kate watched Maggie spin around in front of the mirror. No, her sister looked amazing in this outrageous outfit. A mini dress of rich red color, embroidered with gold sequins, held on thin straps and with the back open to the waist, through which the dress was decorated with gold chains. The image was completed with stiletto heels and bright evening makeup with Egyptian eyeliner. Your parents will never let you out like that, Kate said, but her voice was full of admiration and envy. She wouldn't have let herself wear it, or even try it on. I don't care, Maggie winked at her reflection. I'm an adult, and I can do what I want. You're only 17, but you're 19, Miss Boring, and you're going to finish college without going to a single party. Catherine just shook her head. Yes, Maggie was right about something. She sometimes felt so disconnected from the fun college life. But on the other hand, how could she think about such silly things instead of studying? That's not how her parents raised her. It's not the way they raised Maggie either. Except it didn't work on her. Maggie, unlike Kate, had grown up to be very bold, sharp-tongued, and uncontrollable. She couldn't, like a good girl, come home at 9 o'clock and not a minute later. She didn't study only for top grades, and yes, her mother literally cut her skirts of inappropriate length and short tops with scissors, but Maggie managed to get money for new ones somewhere. No other way to save money for school lunches, and she was also working part-time, of course, handing out flyers, a secret Kate kept. In general, Kate was sad, because it was because of Maggie recently in the house fiercely sounded scandals. Sometimes it seemed at all that Maggie was deliberately looking for an occasion. Or maybe she wasn't. And often, by the way, Kate was on her side. She, for example, thought it was cruel to make Maggie eat an empty celery omelet for breakfast because she supposedly needed to lose weight while the rest of the family ate bacon and pancakes. But the harsh fact was that Kate was usually on the sidelines. No, she could sympathize with Maggie, but then secretly, because, what would happen if she dared support her sister in front of Mom or Dad? Then they'd both be dead. Yes, the fact that Catherine was now in college did not change much for her. For her was still important words of support and guidance from her parents. She still, when she came to visit on vacation, Her heart sank if something did something wrong and her mother has not yet said a word, but just threw a stern look. That night, Maggie still sneaked out of the house, and Catherine until the morning tormented by guilt and inability to say that, no, her sister is not sleeping peacefully in her room. She went out with friends. And in the morning, when Maggie returned, Catherine was sick with excitement. She was just sitting down to breakfast, and Maggie, satisfied like a cat that had eaten a tub of sour cream, stood and listened to her mother reprimand her. And she could see in her eyes that she was not a bit better in her ugly behavior. And she cast conspiratorial glances at Kate, and it made her so unbearably gregarious. And then, one morning, Maggie did not come down to breakfast. "She's gone," Mom said. "Where?" said Kate, yawning sleepily and pouring milk over the cereal in her bowl. "I choose school. A private boarding school, where her behavior will be monitored," Dad said. This came as a complete surprise to Catherine. No, she'd heard something like that. Maggie had said her parents threatened to re-educate her and swore she'd never ever go. "Well, we just talked," Mom continued, "and we decided it was best for her." She agreed. "I see," Kate shrugged. "Why didn't she say goodbye?" "I didn't want to wake you up," Dad said. Catherine shrugged again and sat down to breakfast. She had enough to worry about after all. She was about to go back to college, and she was already preparing for it hard. She had stayed up late last night and then fell asleep as she had never slept before. Only in the morning something woke her up. I think something dropped downstairs. Probably her father was watching the game late again and accidentally knocked a dish with salted nuts off the table, for example. Kate went back to college, and the whole private school thing was forgotten. But she wondered how Maggie was doing. After all, it was so unusual for her to go to some closed institution, practically, according to her parents, a boarding school for noble girls, like those about which English writers wrote in the 19th century. And at first Kate thought that her sister wouldn't last a month there. She'd go home, well, or expel her. As it happened before, more than one school changed Maggie for her antics. But time passed, said parents reported. Maggie was studying. Everything was fine. No, she wouldn't come on vacation. It wasn't supposed to be, but they saw her once every 2 or 3 months and everything was fine. And then, on the very day Maggie finally turned 18 and had to leave the walls of the school, she disappeared. It was known that she took a bus, but then she got off at a small station for some reason near a town. She had no friends there, nothing, and no one there that could explain this strange act. But it happened. And then, according to eyewitnesses, Maggie simply walked off down a path leading into a national park, or disappeared into it without a trace. The police officers in charge of the case said that although there were no direct signs of violence, but probably the sister was the victim of some crime and the chances of finding her alive one day, almost minimal. They also suggested that she might have gone mad. True. It seemed personally unbelievable to Kate. Yes, Maggie's behavior was not a gift, but she was smart, and even if she was a crazy person but not crazy. Patron didn't notice how she fell asleep. And when she woke up, she found that, first of all, it was a new day, and secondly, that the whole body was so stiff that you could hardly move. The girl sighed. A night of reflection, even though she had slept most of it, had helped her make the right decision. She needed to go to the police. "You'll have to wait," said an officer named Martin. "The detective will be here shortly, but my opinion is that it would be better if you contacted the department that is handling the case." "I'd have to go to another state," Kate said. "And he's here." "I understand your logic and your situation," Miss Martin shook his head. But you better sit down, okay? Have some water." "I don't need water." Lighting time dragged on agonizingly slowly. But at last the right man arrived. Detective Jerry was a man of African-American descent, about 50 years old. He was dressed in a strict black suit with a white shirt, and the only bright detail was a bracelet on his left wrist, unusually colorful for his image of a law enforcement officer. "My daughter gave it to me," he explained, as if to justify the paltry piece of thread. "She was into weaving, and now everyone was wearing it." He smiled, but immediately became serious again. So, let's go over it all again in order." Catherine told everything. And then she was shocked when Jerry told her that there was no way they could go to Ben's house right now and question him. And there's no way to go into his house. "You see, we need a warrant to search his house, and it's not going to be easy to get one just from you," he said, as if embarrassed by his own helplessness. "But I can send a request to the local sheriff, so that he, so to speak, starts to understand the situation. Jerry also said that, theoretically, it was possible to get a warrant, but even for a simple conversation with Ben, they'd have to find out where he was at the moment of Maggie's disappearance. And then, unless they had clear evidence, they wouldn't be able to. Evidence? Kate exclaimed. What proof do you need to believe me? I saw it with my miss. Don't worry. Jerry made a soothing gesture with his hand, as if urging Kate to sit back in the chair from which he had jumped up. And please don't take this personally, but we've already had, unfortunately, situations where, because of a rift in a couple, one of the partners said that the other, are you saying that Ben and I had a fight and I'm deliberately bad-mouthing him? Kate couldn't get it all out of her head. The fact that she was seen as a hysterical fool and the fact that the U.S. police refused to help her, and she had heard so many good things about them. They were such heroes in the movies. Well, I guess I should go, she said, holding on to the crumbs of her personal dignity to keep from crying. Jerry said they'd be sure to gather as much information about Ben as they could, and they'd contact the detectives who'd been investigating Maggie's disappearance. He also advised Kate to stay away from Ben for the time being, just in case, and especially not to ask him anything on her own, because if she was right after all. Catherine, thanking for the help and advice, left, except that she was not going to do what she was told and realized. She must figure out everything on her own, and when she brought and shoved her sister's dress under Jerry's nose, he would only have to agree with her. It was going to take time to get it right, though, as the workdays at the coffee shop were starting, and it would be a few days before she could be at Ben's house again. And how hard that time was for Kate. But she held on. She had time to think about everything, and a whole plan had matured in her head. And so, a few days later, having finally agreed with Ben that she would go back to his place this weekend, Kate was on her way home to pack a few things. She was tense, but she tried to calm down, for Ben was not to guess anything. Kate was so absorbed in herself that she didn't notice the car at all. It was an old car, a white and gray van. It had shown up a couple days ago and had been parked outside the coffee shop where she worked for almost a day, and then it was parked outside the building where she rented an apartment. And certainly, immersed in her worries, Catherine didn't feel a pair of evil, hating eyes following her. Bad, dirty girl, said the man lurking in the shadows of the alley. He raised his hand and rubbed his neck nervously. He always sweated profusely when it was time not just to watch a girl, to hang around her, or even pretend to be close to her, but to prepare to reveal his true nature to her. Oh, you bitch. The man exhaled and bared his yellowish teeth in a grin. You'll find out from me soon enough. When they met, Ben hugged Kate and told her he was happy that she had decided to spend the weekend with him instead of in the stuffy city. Hey, we could go to the lake and go boating, he suggested. How would you like that? I wonder, Kate smiled, and even kissed him. If she was going to play her part, she was going to play it to the fullest, so that he wouldn't suspect a thing until the very end. And before, by the way, Catherine did not realize that she had such acting skills. But first, a romantic dinner, she added. I found a recipe and I want to surprise you. So, Ben sighed, stretching, and in that lazy yet powerful movement, he looked like a wildcat. I have to go to the store, or will canned beans and a piece of beef stew. Actually, Kate faked a pout. I need shrimp, spinach noodles, and parmesan. Okay, baby, Ben grinned. Oh, what are you doing to me? Before I met you, I would have had less. I'm teaching you manners and nutrition. One is lucky to have such a smart wife. Ben gave her a playful kiss goodbye. And when the door closed behind him and the engine roared a couple of minutes later, Kate almost burst into tears. It turned out to be incredibly difficult to deceive her favorite man, who suddenly turned out to be a maniac. For some time the girl stood, clenching her temples with her fingers. And then she went to the room with the closet. It was time to act. When Maggie was going out with her friends, she didn't think it would end like this. No, of course, she realized that her parents would be furious, but she also knew that their anger had its limits. When the girl got home between 3 and 4 in the morning, she unlocked the door with her own key, and taking off her shoes, she was going to sneak upstairs like a mouse. If she was as lucky as possible, they probably wouldn't know she hadn't been home at all, or they'd start a scandal right away. But this morning, of course, they gave her a scandal. And Maggie listened patiently to the reproaches, and as if even learned them. But just a couple of days later, she again decided to leave the house. Now she was going to a neighborhood party. She went downstairs quietly, and the clock, by the way, was already 11 o'clock in the evening, but suddenly a light flashed in the living room. Maggie blinked, squinted. Her mother and father stood before her. Their faces were tense, and the next thing Maggie noticed were strangers. 3 closets of the most gangly kind. Mom, Dad. She wanted to ask, what's going on? Who are these people? But then the men rushed to her and the nightmare began. One of them gagged her with a rag. The other one put her hands behind her back and tied her wrists with something, immobilizing her. And then the first one threw her over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes and carried her out of the house. Maggie squealed silently and resisted helplessly as best she could in the situation. But what could she do? Only stare with widened eyes at her parents, who were watching all this calmly, maybe with a tinge of sympathy, but they certainly weren't going to save their daughter. By some miracle, Maggie managed to free herself from the gag, by which time she was already in the car. "No, what are you doing? Help me." But she was pinned down again. She was held tightly by a big man, and naturally a 17-year-old girl was no match for him. A needle flashed in the other man's hands, and Maggie felt a prick in her arm, after which a sickening weakness quickly spread through her body. She realized she was losing consciousness, and then the car started to move. She didn't know how long they drove like that. At times she seemed to regain her senses, but then she slipped back into a disgusting, viscous, and as if tart sleep. "Mommy," the girl called softly and began to cry. She asked for water. She whispered pitifully, humiliatedly, that she had to go to the toilet. But they told her to shut up and only gave her a second injection. Maggie didn't understand what was happening, just waited to see what she was. Well, probably about to be killed, and then the car stopped. She was carried out in her arms. The walls flashed, the corridors were gray. She was thrown onto a hard bed, and the restraints were finally removed. She lost her senses again. Catherine had already plunged into the bowels of the closet, dumping out its contents to reach the back wall, when suddenly she heard the sound of a car pull up. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Ben back. He must have forgotten something. She flew out of the room. If he'd forgotten, he'd take it and drive back. Except the car in front of the house wasn't Ben's, it was his brother Matthew's. "Oh, hello." Catherine smiled so big that her lips ached. "Ben's not here. He's at the stack." When the girl had been in Chicago on the police force, she had wondered if she should have gone to Matthew first, but she'd been scared for a moment. They were brothers. What if he wouldn't believe her either? But now she felt a wave of confidence. If she showed him the creepy closet, Matt would have no choice but to believe her. "I have to show you something." Kate blurted out and grabbed the sheriff, who was clearly stunned, and dragged him into the house. "I'm sorry. I know you love Ben, and I did too, but you have to help me. We have to stop him." "What?" Matt mumbled. "What are you talking about, Katie?" He'd mangled her name in the American way again, but if it had pissed her off before, it didn't matter now. There were more important things to do. "There." Now, Kate flew into the room in a mini hurricane and rushed to the closet. "Here. This is where he kept his trophies." She slid aside the false wall of the closet, opening the pantry, turned on the light, and froze. Stared, because the pantry was completely empty. No maps on the walls, no pictures, no belongings, and the dress was gone too. Catherine slowly turned back around to Matthew, because she heard something, a quiet chuckle. And now she saw it, a grin on his lips. And Kate broke into a cold sweat at the realization. Matthew knew everything. He knew who Ben really was. "Hey, new girl." "No." Someone gently shook Maggie's shoulder. "Wake up, come on." She groaned pitifully, struggled to get her eyes open, and in her first instinctive movement, jerked to the side and immediately banged her head painfully against the wall. She rubbed the back of her head. Maggie realized where she was, in a room. 2 beds, 2 chairs, 2 small tables. A closet, too, all furnished very simply. There were windows, as if there were windows, but they were closed and you couldn't see outside. On the edge of her bed sat a girl, a little younger than her, it seems, dressed in a gray suit. Skirt, jacket, and shirt. No, what? Where am I? What's going on? You must be thirsty. The girl asked sympathetically, holding out a glass of water, and Maggie greedily drained it. "My name is Angela. I was kidnapped." Maggie sobbed. "No, so was I," Angela sighed. "I don't remember anyone ever being brought here willingly." "Well, unless they tricked their parents into saying it's just a school." "Now, what are you talking about?" Maggie didn't understand, but something was starting to come to her mind. bits and pieces of it. A reform school, Angela said. A private institution. Or a camp for troubled teens. No, my parents. Maggie shook her head. Let me guess. Angela squinted. You've probably heard them talk about how you need to be re-educated, right? Or maybe they even told you they should send you to some boarding school, only once or twice. I didn't think. No, they couldn't have done that. They could. Angela cut her off harshly. Believe me, they could. It costs a hell of a lot of money to study here, so your parents thought very carefully before they sent you here. I want to leave. No. They signed papers saying they trust us to be our guardians until we come of age. Angela waved her hand. It kind of becomes the school and its staff. How long do you have to stay? I'll be 18 in 7 months. Lucky girl. I'm still only 16, but I was an honor student in high school and here. I don't know if they'll let me graduate before the others, or if they'll marinate me until I'm of age. Okay, I gotta get you cleaned up. With these words, she went to the closet and came back with a set of clothes, the same as her own. Go wash up and change your clothes. Do you have any piercings? She asked sympathetically, and Maggie shook her head in the negative. That's good. Or they could have ripped it out, and it was unclear whether Angela was joking or telling the truth. Come on. You'll soon be taken to the principal. He'll tell you about the rules here. We'll live together. The curriculum is normal. Well, almost. Girls aren't allowed to play sports here, but they teach us cooking and obedience, and there are also chastity lessons. Well, don't pay attention. The most boring ones you can fall asleep on. The main thing. Angela put her hand on Maggie's shoulder. To be obedient. And be patient. Believe me, one day we'll get out of here. Except Maggie wasn't ready to be patient or obedient at first. She couldn't understand how her parents could do such a thing. So she was brought to the principal's office and told him they had no right to keep her here. One more word and you'll go to the punishment cell, doll. Yes, said the principal. A full, bald-headed man puffing shamelessly in the presence of his ward cigar. What the hell are you doing? Maggie shrieked, jumping up from her chair. This is America. It's a free country, and I'm a free citizen of it. You have no right. I'll sue you. You'll pay me $1 million for what you're doing. And this is Utah, doll, the director grinned. But his eyes now looked at Maggie in a way that sent a chill down her spine. And believe me, with a little good parenting, you'll never tell anyone anything, ever. You think you're the first one who's ever been a hound? Believe me, we've had hundreds of kids go through us. And we've returned them all to their parents, a different person. Security. The director shouted in a bass voice and added, when strong guys in uniform burst into the office. Put the little shit in the punishment cell. 48 hours, just water and some pig food. Maggie had been in the shoe for 24 hours. Dark, cold, empty, a concrete box. She came out, choking on tears and snot, and begging for no more torture. But after 3 days of seeming submission, but in fact intimidated submission, again began to rebel. In general, Maggie, though she did not seek it, but quickly gained some fame among the inhabitants of the closed school, because she was punished more often than others. And only one person surpassed her in this, a boy named Roger. He, too, was 17 and had been sent here after his father's death by his stepmother. Sometimes it seemed as if Roger was deliberately seeking punishment just to annoy his near prisoners. You can't break me anyway. I'll roll you into a scone and throw it down the Gooston. Laughed as the two men dragged him to the holding cell. This was witnessed by Maggie, who was just being dragged out of the punishment cell. She also saw that one of the men had a bruised nose, and Roger winked at her, saying, "Look how tough I am." The boys and girls lived in different buildings, but they studied in the same classes, and gradually, somehow unnoticed even by themselves, Maggie and Roger developed a special bond. They could exchange glances that were imperceptible to others, and that were so telling to themselves, at times at nightmarish risks, they even managed to pass notes to each other. But still, no matter how brave Maggie was, and as time went on, she began not that she was breaking down, but somehow ashamed of her position. Her parents had visited her only 3 times during her time at the school. The headmaster had assured them that too much contact with her family was detrimental to the educational process. And Maggie, she could not explain to herself why it was so, but only at the meeting with her parents she spoke as if she were reading a piece of paper, Yes, she was studying. Yes, everything was good. Yes, everything was normal. However, these meetings were always in the personal presence of the principal and a couple of other people, including Mrs. Lillian, the person in charge of the punishment system. That's why Maggie kept her mouth shut. She was afraid her parents wouldn't believe her, and she'd get it when they left. Only once, 2 months before graduation, on their last visit, did Maggie make up her mind. She silently lifted the sleeve of her jacket, showing the red marks on her arm. The marks from the straps they'd tied her with in the hospital when she dared to deliberately poison herself with some berries. Just enough to make her nauseous, give her a rash, and allow her to skip classes. Her parents rounded their eyes, and Maggie was about to open her mouth to say, "Help, I'm being tortured here. Can't you see that?" But the principal intervened. He'd noticed too. "I have to apologize," he said, and he looked like a man who could be trusted. We didn't look after your girl. During the riding lesson, she got her hand tangled in the reins. We were afraid she would break everything. I understand if you want to take her away immediately and terminate the contract, as well as sue and demand moral compensation." "No, I don't." Maggie's mom shook her hands. "Your school has such good reviews." "No, we won't." "They're teenagers," she smiled. "They're always getting bruises and scrapes, aren't they?" Maggie's father only told her to be careful and sternly remarked that that's why she'd been sent here. To keep her safe, because she'd behaved so badly in the past that she was asking for trouble. Then her parents left, and Maggie was punished. One day she was going to meet Roger, secretly in the garden behind the school's outbuildings, but he didn't come. But instead of him came a girl, red-haired Maggie, who, by the way, was here because she had allegedly done something to the new wife of her millionaire father. So, once again, it was the evil stepmother's fault. It was on this basis, the similarity of life's hardships, 13-year-old Maggie, and became a loyal friend of Roger and played for him, and Maggie the role of liaison, passed notes and verbal messages. "They've taken him away," she whispered the news. "Where?" Maggie was frightened. She might have believed, given Roger's insolence, that the headmaster would decide to get rid of him altogether. "I don't know." Maggie looked around apprehensively. But in the middle of the night, a motorcade came. Some people showed the headmaster some papers and took Roger away. "Anyway, he's gone." "And he didn't tell me anything?" Maggie asked. "Actually, there is something," said Maggie uncertainly. "He said to just wait. That one day it would be." "What's that supposed to mean?" "I don't know," Maggie said. It's all very mysterious." Maggie spent the rest of the time before graduation in an extremely depressed state. So depressed that her mentor's torturers even began to think that perhaps she had finally come to her senses. And Maggie, without any additional coercive measures, on the eve of graduation, in the principal's office, with her own hand and under his dictation, wrote a letter of thanks to her native school, where she described how nice it was to live here and assured that she had no claims and undertook not to disclose any information. And then the girl put on her favorite dress. Her parents had given it to her. She left the school and took the bus. She was supposed to just go home, but suddenly she got off the bus, and after that she disappeared. Catherine, looking at Matthew, realized the meaning of the expression about the soul going to the heels. "What is it?" Matt looked into the pantry closet with feigned surprise. Well, the house was old and Ben didn't need it, so he decided to block it off with furniture. And the closet, by the way, belonged to the previous owners of the house. There are even documents for that. So, "Oh, Katie," he clucked his tongue. "I'm afraid we'll have to have a serious talk about everything." Catherine swallowed hard. Something told her that the conversation would not be pleasant, and that it would be even worse when Ben returned, grabbing the lamp. It was an antique with a lavender shade. Kate didn't think that it was dangerous to hit someone on the head like that, and then, with a short swing, hit Matthew in the temple, and when he fell to the floor, shrieking and clutching his head and face, she ran out of the room, out of the house. She had come in Ben's car, which meant there was no way to get away from here. Catherine's gaze lingered for a moment on the sheriff's car, but she quickly realized that it was a bad idea, even if she managed to get the keys off Matt's belt when she got back to the house. I wonder, she thought, if he was there, alive at all. But immediately the girl rushed to run. No time to think and linger, we need to save ourselves. Fortunately, there was a road nearby. It was not the busiest, but yes, there were cars passing along it. Kate stood on the side of the road and waved both arms vigorously. "May, please, somebody stop." She pleaded to no one as a couple of cars sped past, for some reason not caring about fellow travelers. But then a car pulled out from somewhere off to the side, around a bend that split the large roads into many small roads. It was an old white van, but one that seemed to be kept in decent condition by its owner. It slowed down beside Kate. "Good afternoon, miss." The driver, a stoutly built man of obscure height, for he was sitting now, touched the brim of his baseball cap with his fingers and smiled, flashing his eyes behind the thick lenses of his glasses. "Need to go into town, yes." Kate blurted out, and almost immediately did not spill everything, that she was fleeing from the house of a maniac and his accomplice, and at the same time brother and sheriff, police. "And you? Are you in Greentown?" She wondered if her destination was the small town where Matt was sheriff. Kate had no doubt that if she showed up there, she'd be arrested in 5 minutes at the most on the orders of Matt, who'd certainly come to his senses by now for some far-fetched reason. And there, she'd be trapped for sure. "Actually, I have to go to Chicago." Kate licked her lips nervously. "I can pay." "It's no big deal," the driver dismissed her. "Actually, that's exactly where I need to go." "In a hurry?" he asked as Kate climbed into the car and fastened her seatbelt with trembling fingers. "Then I think we should take a shortcut." And he turned the car abruptly on the empty road and speeded off in the opposite direction. That is, to the country road from which he had come. But the fact that it was very strange to go back in, that the road to Chicago was in a completely different direction, somehow did not immediately reach to Catherine Simpson. "I know all the roads here," said the driver, as if reading her confused and, alas, too late thoughts. "You have no idea how many young fools vote like that on the roads in the middle of nowhere, and they believe, silly girls, that a good guy will stop next to them." The driver suddenly chuckled, and looking at Kate, wetly smacked his lips. "Only I, my girl, am not a good guy at all." The girl's hand was fumbling for the car door handle, and her gaze was stuck to the man behind the wheel. He slowed down, and Kate still had time to think, and how he was not afraid of losing control. But he apparently didn't care, because he was distracted by the fact that, from somewhere under the seat, he quickly extracted a dirty rag and a vial, wet it, and then pressed it to the face of her companion, who hadn't even had time to scream. Kate threw up her hands, but he was stronger, one hand on her neck, pressing forward, the other with the rag blocking her nose and mouth. A strange, acrid odor hit her sense of smell, and, it seemed, her very brain, and then Kate, before she could even taste the feeling of overwhelming terror, fell into darkness. He'd seen her a long time ago, and he realized at once that she was an extraordinary girl, not at all like the girls he had seen before, and certainly not like those ordinary girls. It was an overcast, cold day, when it seemed as if all of Chicago had fallen into gloom. He went into a coffee shop to get a latte and a sandwich on special offer because he was used to saving money. Yes, perhaps that was his second problem after lack of female attention, lack of money. How he had envied all those rich bums, gold-digging dumb guys and gals in his youth who didn't appreciate what they had and squandered their money. Unlike them, he knew the value of every cent. He grew up in a simple working-class family. His father, however, began to drink a lot towards the end and raised his hand at home too often, more often than they all deserved. And Jim, already at the age of 6, realized, by the way, that his father beats him not just there, and for the cause, whips him with a belt with a heavy metal badge, not for malicious intent, but because he wants him to grow up to be a decent man. Jim, already at the age of 8, stopped sticking up for his mother when his father attacked her with fists, because he realized that his father does not do it for nothing. His mother is probably guilty too. Jim was never an excellent student, but he managed to get a scholarship and went to college. He quickly realized what he wanted to be, a teacher, to instill knowledge and truths about life and the world around him into the heads of youngsters. And 15 years of work flew by like a day. True, at work sometimes there was trouble. Among the pupils there were sissies who were snotty. They complained, and Jim was reprimanded for his allegedly not pedagogical methods. What did they know? Jim was convinced that he never punished anyone for nothing, and in general he was still too soft. And then when he was well into his 30s, he was invited to work at a boarding school, designed to rehabilitate troubled teens, and Jim rejoiced. At last his talents found a use for them. At last he could do anything he saw fit. Well, almost everything, because there were of course rules. And he wasn't crazy enough to break them and get in trouble with the law, not at all, but even if he eventually reached the principal's chair, above which there was only the board of trustees, which owned this school and a few others scattered in the most loyal states of America. But Jim realized one day it's not enough for him. And then his first time happened. Exciting and unforgettable. Just one day, Jim picked up a girl on the road. They talked and she bragged that her parents forbade it. But she still ran away from home to go to the concert of her favorite rock band. A dark flame flared up inside Jim. He realized that this young fool needed to be taught a lesson. And looking back later, at first, he was horrified. How had he gotten so far? But then he realized, no, he hadn't gone too far. It's just that some lessons for bad girls have to be just that. There's no fixing them. Can't re-educate them. But it's his duty as an educator to teach them one last lesson. The realization of his own great mission in this world helped him quickly get rid of the fear of being caught, exposed by the police. But like that first time, Jim was no longer in a hurry. Now he chose his victim in advance, looked closely, learned everything about her, and only then he proceeded to the educational process. And now on his way met her, Catherine. She smiled so warmly, handing up in the order, that he first thought that here, what a pure, sweet girl, a young woman in the prime of her splendor. But then, when he had already moved away from the counter of the cafe, he suddenly heard her talking on the phone. The harlot. She was talking to a guy and going to his place for the weekend. Jim hadn't noticed the ring on her finger. He felt as bad as if he'd been punched in the solar plexus. It was a deafening, bitter disappointment. But Jim realized that there was a world full of immoral girls like that. And he could, in principle, forget about this blonde girl, on whose badge was written the playful name Katie, but something did not give him peace. It took him a few days to find out and realize what it was. He remembered that the parents of one of the girls had shown him their family photos, and there was a picture of Katie. Then Jim put the two together and realized it was the sister of that naughty girl named Maggie. He'd heard the fool had gone missing, but he'd had absolutely nothing to do with it. But now he had a new goal, and he began to plan and wait patiently for the right moment. And now the moment had come. The sky was covered with low, gray clouds. Jim staggered a little, carrying his burden. His back was a problem, and his age was making itself felt. All the men in his family aged early. Exhaling from the strain, he finally set it down on the grassy bed. Then he threw off his backpack and sat down beside her, unzipped it, and started unloading all the necessary things. The forest was quite deaf in this part. There were no hiking trails because it was close to the protected area, and Jim liked to bring silly girls here. Catherine moaned softly and moved. Her head ached. There was a nasty taste in her mouth, and it seemed that her whole body was stiff as after a long sleep. The picture in front of her eyes was blurred, fuzzy, but as it cut across her consciousness, when she saw the man leaning over, What are you doing? No, please. The words came out of her mouth in a weak stream. She didn't know exactly what was happening yet, but she knew it was something very, very bad. She tried to stand up, but she couldn't. Her legs and arms were entangled in plastic ties. It was lucky, she thought, that her hands were tied at the front and not at the back. Otherwise, she would have looked like a beetle tipped on its back by a nasty predator. "You're Maggie's sister," Jim said, not asking, just stating the fact. "Maggie, you." The thoughts in Catherine's head were running fast and confused, but she understood something too well. "No, I didn't kill her and I don't know who did," Jim said before a scream escaped the girl's lips. "I suppose I should introduce myself." He smiled, took off his glasses and put them in his pocket. Without them, of course, you could see worse, but Jim had always felt a little inferior in them, ever since a tough kid in high school had nicknamed him Four Eyes, and for asking him not to insult him, had rinsed Jim's head in the toilet to the laughter of his classmates. "I'm the principal of your sister's school. I was entrusted with such a beautiful flower. That girl had so much potential, but she took a bad path, and you, her older sister, are the same." He smiled sadly. "But do you know what my secret is?" "Me, please, sir." Catherine did not know how to behave with maniacs. Who would even think about such a thing in advance? But somehow she felt that pleading would not get through to him. "Let me go. I won't say anything to anyone. My secret is that I'm not only a talented teacher, but also the author of my own methodology." With these words, Jim twirled something sharp and shiny in his hands. Kate's throat constricted with choking nausea because you didn't have to be an expert on crime stories to suppose that this something sharp and shiny was going to be used on you. Helpless and sobbing, sprawled on a forest floor somewhere in the wilderness. Meanwhile, Jim, in colors, vividly described the essence of his methodology. And Kate, meanwhile, stopped crying because she was absorbed in pure, somehow primal horror. She simply realized that there was something in front of her that had little to do with being human. And she was far from the first to be here, in this corner of the forest near the cliff, the outline of the top of which resembled the face of a grizzly. They're here. They're the other girls. Long dead, fresh, and hidden shallowly. And she, according to Jim, it was just under 24 hours before she joined them, which Kate realized with horror promised to be excruciatingly endless for her. As Matt began to come to his senses, he discovered two things. First, a frail, petite Katie had a lot of strength to stun him like that, albeit with a lamp, and he was clearly losing his self-defense skills, and he had been an excellent student at the police academy. The second was his brother's concerned face leaning over him. "Well, what's wrong?" "Katie found your stash," Matt said, managing to suppress the sweary adjective. "And I told you he'd be trouble if anyone ever found out. Now see him." "But what are the odds that someone's going to be poking around the back of someone else's closet?" Ben mumbled, helping his brother to sit up as he moved his senseless body to the living room couch and handed him a bag of frozen broccoli. "We should get you to the hospital." "It'll wait," Matt said, hissing softly as he applied the ice pack to the injured area. She ran away, obviously thinking we were a couple of psychopaths, a maniac and the sheriff covering for him. She could make a lot of noise. She's already contacted the Chicago police, by the way. "No. What?" Ben's eyes widened. "When? Why didn't you tell me?" "I just found out myself this morning. You know, a little birdie told me." "Actually, they don't know much about your story. Hey, how did they take it?" "They thought it was a jilted girlfriend getting back at her boyfriend, that's all. But the fact is, now don't be surprised if they start looking at you." "No, don't talk nonsense." Ben snorted, rising from the couch. He used both hands to tussle the hair on his head, which had already grown back into a mound of coal-black curls, and paced the room nervously. "I must find her and talk to her. Tell her the truth." "I agree." For the first time, Matt said with a sigh, lengths and cities a brain storyboard started when Ben was a 16-year-old boy. In the backwoods of Idaho, where he was from, entertainment was scarce. And so Ben's family feared that one day the adventurous boy would get into trouble. And so in principle, it happened. One fine evening, Ben volunteered to drive around the land that belonged to his family. They kept cattle, and now it was necessary to keep an eye on how and where they grazed and whether coyotes or others violated the boundaries of the land. When Ben noticed the stranger, he wanted to rush home, warn his parents, or at least the hired help. They were tough guys, real cowboys in the coolest sense of the word, but something did not allow him to realize his plan at once. Some vague feeling. He approached the stranger and realized he was wounded. Ben spoke to him and was shocked by what he heard. It turned out that this guy, who introduced himself as Tom, was supposed to be an important witness in the case against the traffickers of disapproved substances, but the cop's car in which he was being transported had been attacked. Tom said that apparently these villains had informants among the local authorities. Tom was afraid he wouldn't live to see the trial, which was to take place in 3 days in a town that was a long way away, and then Ben made a bold, but at the same time, a reckless decision. He decided that he would become a guide for Tom. The thing was, Ben had lost his grandfather a year ago, and while the old man was alive, he had taught him how to navigate the terrain, survive in the wilderness, and many other things. The old man said that among his own ancestors were bounty hunters and other dashing fellows, from whom he had learned the knowledge that is not taught in modern universities and even in your police academies. Tom doubted very much that the green boy would be a good chaperone, but what else was he to do? He was very much afraid that they would get rid of him. So Ben left home. In general, he lied that to a friend. He supposedly broke his leg and the girl dumped him, and the refusal from the college came. In general, it would be necessary to support. With this lie, he won exactly a day's head start, and there, of course, he was grabbed. Parents were shocked. Moreover, the locals spread the news about the murdered policeman. Rangers, volunteers, went to look for Ben. They even sent a helicopter and search dogs. But Ben and his companion could not be found. And then they showed up in that town, right on the day of the trial. Ben escorted a valuable witness literally to the courtroom. And naturally, it turned out to be a very big story. Ben was in a lot of trouble. His parents were furious. But the guy found his defenders, the sheriff of his hometown, who by this time had figured out who of his subordinates also worked for the bad guys. "You ought to go to the FBI or the CIA, kid," the old sheriff said and shook Ben's hand in a mature way. "Don't scold him too much," the sheriff told his parents. "He did something that not every cop has the guts to do. To think of it. He patched Tom up, took him through some wild places, mixed up his tracks. You'll go far." And himself, by the way, was shy and didn't want the fame. He refused any interviews, didn't take part in the show. And little by little they got rid of him. And then he moved closer to his brother. And then, anyway, a woman came to him. She'd been beaten by her husband for years. She was afraid to leave him because he had connections, he said. She begged him to help her escape, especially since she was pregnant and afraid he'd take the baby away. Ben helped. He arranged for her to move to a quiet, sleepy little town and arranged everything so that her husband thought she had run away with her lover to Europe in the first place. Then this woman still risked filing for divorce. The child stayed with her, and the scoundrel got a restraining order to come within 100 meters of her. Then something else happened. Ben was approached by the parents of a teenage girl who'd been kidnapped by some cult madman who decided to sacrifice her to the god of chaos. The authorities were looking for her, but they said there was no chance. Because the psychopath had taken the victim into the mountains, Ben wasn't officially allowed to investigate, and he didn't ask for it. He did it all himself. He found the madman and saved the child. In general, Ben didn't plan to deal with such cases. He had enough of his work with wood, construction. But after this case with the rescued girl, the authorities contacted him and offered to become, so to speak, a freelance specialist who could be called upon for help as needed. Now, Ben was called upon when there was a need to escort a person from point A to point B without anyone knowing about it. He consulted on wilderness searches for people and participated in some rescue expeditions himself. And he had one weakness. Sometimes he asked these people for some trifle belonging to them as a souvenir for himself. In general, his, so to speak, official superiors did not approve of this, but Ben in principle trusted, and he could do so. And many people willingly gave him things as souvenirs, because these people were sincerely grateful to him, their savior. And 5 years ago, perhaps one of Ben's most difficult and unusual cases happened. It all started with the fact that a detective who had been working with him for years shared with him some very interesting and unusual information. An investigation was launched into a network of private schools, where rumor had it that they not only taught teenagers and kept them in strict discipline, but also practiced all kinds of abuse on them. Gathering evidence was very difficult. It was extremely difficult to send their people to these institutions under the guise of staff. And then it was decided to try to ask for help from some of the students. Yes, it turned out that it was necessary to involve minors in active and dangerous actions, but there was no other way out. Ben's new assignment was to be a girl named Maggie. He had to pick her up in a small town and then take her to the office of the detective in charge of the case. And at first, it seemed that everything was going according to plan. But Maggie suddenly refused to go anywhere. And in fact, it turned out that another man had already come for her. It was her school acquaintance, Roger. He had been pulled out of school by his father's lawyer, who was also a friend of the family. And now Roger, being of legal age himself, offered Maggie to run away with him to Mexico. And Maggie agreed. She told Ben that she realizes how important her testimony is to the investigation, but she doesn't want to risk her life, because then she would become an enemy to such powerful people. And besides, Maggie just wanted to start a new life after all she had been through. She was very angry at her parents for sending her to this nightmare place. She was convinced that they suspected something about the way she was being treated, but turned a blind eye to it. It turned out that she and Roger had already planned the whole thing. He was ready to arrange everything so that Maggie would be thought to be missing or dead, and then they could start a whole new life in Mexico. Ben was faced with a monstrously difficult choice. For if he agreed with Maggie, then he was betraying the people he was working with. He realized that all of this, it wasn't exactly legal, but Ben agreed to help. He quickly got to know Roger, and the two of them perfected the plan. Ben helped the boys escape through the woods, where Roger's men would pick them up. But Maggie, unfortunately, was inexperienced in the wilderness and fell into some trap set by poachers. She just walked away from the camp into the bushes alone. Although Ben told her not to do that, she bumped her side on a wooden stake, and Ben barely managed to give her first aid. Fortunately, they soon met up with the people Roger's lawyer had helped him hire, and Maggie's life was now safe. And before they parted, Ben asked her to give him the dress. The girl agreed. Ben then pretended he'd lost Maggie. He was believed. And only his brother knew the truth. 4 years went by, and then the authorities found out the truth. They were ready to bring some charges against Ben, but he was a valuable specialist after all. So they just reprimanded him, especially since they needed his help again. The thing was that, first of all, the trial against these private schools was about to start. They finally had enough evidence and testimonies from former students. And secondly, the detectives began to suspect that the principal of one of the schools in Utah and the maniac attacking girls in many states is the same person. And now they were on his trail. Ben was also helping in his search, but even with all his talents, this thing just seemed elusive. More than 10 victims, young girls. And only recently, according to the detectives, did they get on his trail. And now we could only hope that he would be caught before he sent another victim to the grave. "Your phone's ringing," Matt said to his brother. "Would you at least answer it?" And reluctantly pulled his phone out of his pocket. But when he saw the number, he took the call. It was Detective Larry, with whom they had worked closely over the years, and who had covered for Ben with the authorities after Maggie. "No." "What?" Ben exclaimed. "No. Where is he? What do you mean, stay out of this?" "Larry, you owe it to me to tell me." "No. What's wrong?" Matt asked, but Ben didn't react, just glared. Detective Larry, after a moment's hesitation on the other side, finally gave the approximate coordinates of where the maniac could be. The thing was that only this morning the team of detectives had all the necessary versions, data, and so on, and then someone else became known. About a suspicious type who was driving a white van was reported from a local gas station. This guy was asking a suspicious amount about a local saleswoman, a single mother named Sally, and the owner of the gas station thought it was suspicious. And then the police got a call from another person, a truck driver who first saw a girl jump out and wave her arms at the road, hurriedly voting, and then a strange white van picked her up and drove off in the same direction it had come from. Then the detectives compared the description of the van driver with the approximate portrait of the maniac. In general, Larry assured Ben that the right people had already gone to the supposed area of the villain's location. He assured him that although Ben was a very capable guy, but he should please stay out of the way where the professionals were working, and heard that the girl who got into the van was a blonde in a purple dress and immediately realized that it was his Kate. And now, of course, he couldn't just sit and wait for it to be over. "I'm with you." Matt started to get up from the couch, but immediately sank back down with a groan. He was dizzy. "I'm afraid your fiancé gave me a concussion." "I don't think so." Ben threw open the secret locker in the living room to retrieve his weapon. "You need to go to the hospital." "Okay, I'll call an ambulance," Matt agreed. But are you sure?" "I've never been so sure of anything." Ben said as he ran out the door. "Any last words, doll?" Jim's hot, stinking breath hit Kate's face and she almost threw up. "I'm afraid you'll forget how to talk, not just scream," grinned the maniac. Yes, Kate looked him straight in the eye. She was scared, yes, very scared, but also how much she hated him. She had never realized that it was possible to hate a man so quickly, but it still seemed so natural, after he had confessed all his crimes to her. "I hope you die soon." Her hands were bound in front, and it was this that allowed Kate to suddenly raise them sharply, throwing them forward. The plastic tie caught the cold steel that the maniac was clutching in his right hand, and then Kate drove her hand sharply down and away. Jim gave a confused gasp and dropped the weapon. He wasn't used to his victims fighting back. Usually, they just cried and begged for mercy. He was even more dumbfounded when Kate managed to pull his knee sharply up to his chest, and then, straightening her leg, kicked him hard in the stomach. Jim yelped again, bending in half. "You little bitch. Are you trying to ruin my fun?" He roared and fumbled blindly on the ground, looking for what he had dropped. "You can't always be lucky." Kate exclaimed. "You're going to get caught, you bastard. You think you're special. You're a psycho." "Shut up," shrieked Jim, who suddenly lost his sense of superiority, of boundless power, and even the realization of his own important mission in the world. And all this made him very, very sad, and he was ready to take out all this anger on the obnoxious girl, who stood out from the ranks of his victims so disgustingly, as if deliberately decided to disrupt his pleasure, or get away from her. Kate didn't immediately realize whether the sound was human speech or the growl of a wild animal. But then, turning her head, she saw Ben standing on a low bushy knoll, tense and yet relaxed and dangerous, his legs wide apart, his head tilted forward. Get away from her. "Who the hell are you?" Jim shrieked, his sweat pouring down in a hail. He was no longer angry, but shocked that his plans had been so disgustingly spoiled. "I'll get you." "Ben," Kate exhaled and sprawled on the ground without strength. It had just ended abruptly, and then she just watched what was happening, and it seemed to her that she was watching a scene from a movie. The girl was not quite aware of reality. She was like an outside observer. She saw how the maniac threw at Ben and how he deftly dodged his attack, and then the maniac just flew to the ground, and then howled when Ben snapped his arm and something crunched, as if a dry branch had broken. And the next moment, armed men in uniforms flew into the clearing. They were special agents and police men. Kate felt so strange. She was ready to faint again, but she found the strength to smile weakly at the guy leaning over her. "I'm here, baby. How are you? Let's get you out of here." He was already cutting the ties. "No, I'm sorry." It's okay. That's wrong." "I guess I was wrong, huh?" Kate whispered. You're a good man, aren't you? You didn't kill my sister," she said. "I didn't ask Ma with certainty. I just don't understand. Her dress, how is it?" "I'll explain," Ben said, and Kate blinked. The image before her eyes was blurring. When she woke up again, she realized she was in a hospital room. The doctor who had greeted her on waking explained that the maniac had knocked her out with a very toxic substance to which she had become allergic, but it had fortunately been neutralized. He also said that she had been in a deep sleep for almost 2 days. "You have visitors," the doctor added. "But I would recommend complete rest. Catherine would like to rest too." But she needed the truth even more. And when Ben entered the room, by the way, with a bouquet of flowers, she, as soon as he approached, grabbed his hand tightly. "Do you know what happened to Maggie?" What's happened to her?" It was strange. But it was only when Ben appeared there to rescue her that Catherine suddenly realized in an instant that no, he couldn't be the culprit. And now Ben had told her everything. He had revealed to her the truth about how he had met Maggie and helped her in Roger's escape. He told her about his secret case and apologized for not being able to tell her the truth sooner. "Are you crying because I didn't tell you sooner?" He asked cautiously. "No," Kate sobbed. But Maggie, how could she do this to us, to her family? Mom and Dad, they thought they'd lost her." "Actually, I'm sorry," Ben coughed awkwardly. But I can kind of understand it. It's kind of hard to forgive your parents when you're stuck in a place like this." "But they didn't know what was going on," Kate ejected stubbornly. "I believe that. I wish I did," Ben said, barely audibly. "Kate, actually, the detectives will have to talk to you soon, and your words will be very important in the case against that monster. Also, anyway." Ben turned to enter the room, and Kate rounded her eyes, because Maggie was standing on the doorstep. She had changed over the years, tanned, had a short haircut, but it was still the same Maggie. Standing next to her was a tall, also tanned guy. "Hello," Maggie said and smiled. "Can I come in?" Kate, sobbing, could only nod. Ben, saying he didn't want to intrude, left the room. There was so much they needed to talk about. And they did. Maggie told how they live now. Roger's lawyer had managed to get him a decent sum from his father's inheritance, with which they had bought a house in Mexico and opened a small restaurant on the ocean. Maggie has already given birth to 2 children, twin boys, and, as she admitted, waiting for another child. "I visited different psychologists," she said, lowering her eyes. "I tried to forgive my parents, to understand them." "And how?" Kate asked quietly. "It's not that easy," Maggie sighed. "I'm ready. I can meet them. Kate, they ruined my life. I don't think I'll ever be able to treat them the way I used to, but I've managed to let go of that pain, and I can see them. I can communicate with them a little bit." Maggie also revealed that she's here to finally testify fully against Jim as the school principal. "You have a wonderful fiancé," Maggie smiled. "And actually, he hasn't proposed to me yet, really." "What's this then?" And her sister pointed to one of the flowers in the bouquet, a scarlet rose with a diamond ring glittering in the center of its bud. Kate, gasping, reached for it. "You can put it back and wait for him to ask you," Maggie smiled. "Or you can just put it on his finger and he'll see it when he comes back. It's up to you. Just don't you dare say you won't marry him." They talked for a while longer. Kate got to know Roger and recognized that he was a very good-looking guy. Then Maggie left. "The doctor says you'll be out in a couple of days," said Ben, who had returned to the room. "You'll probably want to go back to your place. Don't worry, there'll be cops outside your house, and they'll put an alarm system in your apartment and—" He said, "Nah, Ben," Kate said, noticing that he glanced at the bouquet and frowned, because the ring wasn't there. "No, it didn't fall off or get lost," he added, taking one hand away from the other so that it was now visible. The ring was on her finger. I'd like to go to your place. If you don't mind, of course." Ben looked at her dumbfounded for a few moments, and then he hugged her. "I love you so much," he said. And Kate cried again, this time with happiness. Kate would have liked the next few months to be filled with joy, for she had found the sister she had long thought dead and could love and be loved again. But unfortunately for her, the next few months were filled with the formalities of a double investigation. Jim had been charged for all his victims, and for the deeds he had done at the private school. And at the same time, though it hadn't been an easy time at all, it had all somehow brought Kate closer to her sister and Ben. And then, when it was all over, Maggie and Roger, as well as Kate, had gone to visit the sister's parents. There was a difficult meeting. They talked about a lot of things. Their parents swore that they were unaware of all the nightmares their daughter had to endure. And it seemed to Kate from the outside that Maggie had almost forgiven them. Then Maggie and her husband returned to Mexico. "Where are you taking me?" Kate asked, because Ben, when she got back to his place, put her in the car and told her he had a surprise for her. "If I tell you, it stops being a surprise," he replied. "Hey, don't peek," he added sternly when Catherine reached for the blindfold. "Hey, whatever you say," she snorted and obeyed. Finally, the car slowed down. Ben helped the bride out of the cabin, holding her gently under the arm and around the waist, because Kate's eyes were still hidden by the blindfold. "It's okay now," he said, taking it off, squinting in the bright midday sun. Kate looked around at the space in front of her with surprised incomprehension. There was a forest in the background, and in front, there was a foundation and some other beginning of construction. "TMG, master. What is this? Did you decide to show off your firm's new project?" "You could say that." Ben grinned. "Look," he pointed with his hand. "Here there will be French windows, and here a veranda, and I also plan—" He described the future house colorfully and clearly, and the longer he talked, the more Kate understood that it would be something extraordinary. "Somebody's going to be lucky," she sighed. Actually, Ben told her, leaning in close to her ear. "If you want, you can add to it, change it." "No. Why?" Kate didn't understand. "No, silly girl." He laughed. Because it's your house, our house. I designed it for you and me. I bought the lot. Even includes a piece of woods and that stream over there, more like a rivulet, see? And so I decided that when we get married, we need something completely new and the best." Kate turned to Ben and looked at him wide-eyed. This was such an unexpected, generous gift. She had been preoccupied with other things ever since he had proposed, and she had accepted it. And she hadn't thought much about where they would live after the wedding. But now, looking at what was yet to become home, she realized that it would be the coziest and best place in the world for her, the best home she could ever dream of. "No, thank you," she said, and raised on tiptoe and kissed him. "I have something to say too." What is it?" Ben asked, looking into her beautiful eyes, which had conquered him at first sight. "I think it is absolutely necessary to plant a nursery in the house." Ben froze, and then, picking her up in his arms, spun her around. This was definitely the happiest day of his life, and he knew there would be many more happy days to come. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark. Bright streetlights shone through the window. Night moths swirled in their light. Their dance mesmerized her, even soothed her. Sleep did not come to the girl. Various thoughts about work, the future, and the past popped into her head.
Upstairs, the neighbors were noisy as usual. They were laughing loudly, talking, even singing songs. That would have been all right, but today was Wednesday. Emily had to get up early for work tomorrow, At 6 a.m., it was a long way to the bus stop, and the drive itself took almost an hour. Emily wondered how her neighbors lived. Okay, the old people got pensions, but the young? The family on the top floor is having a party right now. Do they really live on children's allowances? And the neighbors have a lot of kids.
Dirty, hungry, in rags, perky. They grow like weeds. They're often sick, even die because of parental neglect. Like that boy last year, Jason, I think a 1.5-year-old toddler walked out of the house at night in the winter while his parents were out drinking. They didn't even notice the child wasn't home. They only realized it the next day at lunchtime. But it was too late, the baby had frozen. The older children were taken away from the family. But a year later, the parents had a new baby. And now the neighbor was pregnant again. Emily sighed as she looked at the lives of these children. She realized that she herself was lucky. It could have been worse. Emily had grown up in an orphanage. Yes, she lacked the warmth and care of loved ones, but she was fed, clean, and clothed. In the orphanage, she was trained as a pastry chef, and when she turned 18, the state gave her an apartment in an old wooden 2-story barrack house on the outskirts of the city. Dusty, unasphalted streets, overgrown with grass. Dumps everywhere, garbage was rarely taken out. Every now and then the water, electricity, and heating were cut off. Cockroaches crawled around the apartments. The neighborhood was dysfunctional. Mostly marginal families lived here, like the neighbors upstairs. Also old people and ordinary but poor people with no means to move. Creaking floors, old rickety frames, the smell of damp and mold. But what frightened Emily most of all were the thin walls. Through them she could hear everything from the neighboring apartments. This was the kind of place Emily had gotten. And what to do? There was no choice. She was alone in the world. After coming of age, she had to move out of the orphanage. Where to go? She didn't want to be homeless. So the orphanage graduated and settled in an old barracks with frightening neighbors. But Emily knew that time would pass. She would earn money for an apartment and move away from here to a good place. Now there was a fight brewing upstairs. Usually first there's drinking, fun, dancing, all brothers and sisters. Then there's bound to be conflict, even fights. Squealing, screaming, hitting, the sound of falling furniture and broken dishes. Emily is scared of it all, even though she's lived like this for 2 years. Sometimes drunken neighbors would get the wrong floor and break in her door. Often the debauches happen right under her windows, either fights or romantic scenes. Old Susan, the old lady for whom Emily shopped, was also wary of the neighbors. Emily was an attractive young girl. She should have gotten out of here. The people in this place were not good. Trouble could happen at any moment. Emily realized this and dreamed of moving somewhere else. However, she didn't have that opportunity yet. In Emily's house repeatedly happened fires, almost always because of drunken neighbors. A guest from the top floor fell asleep with a cigarette on the couch, or the neighbor on the right forgot to remove the pot from the stove after getting drunk. Each time, the firefighters got there in time. But the unpleasant smell of burning was a lingering reminder of the incident. Emily was afraid that one day while she slept, a fire would start in the house. The only consolation was that her apartment was on the first floor, and she would be able to jump out quickly. Emily rolled over onto her other side, turning away from the fire. She should get some sleep. Tomorrow was a big day. There would be guests at the rich house where she worked as a maid. Some kind of family celebration. They need people to serve the guests and clean up. Emily will be a waitress. John Susan, an older man with gray hair and kind blue eyes, explained to the servants how to behave during the celebration. Nothing complicated. Don't talk to the guests. Don't attract attention. Slowly shuttle around the territory with a tray of snacks and drinks. Keep an eye on the invitees. If someone makes a sign, walk over so the person can have a treat. These will be people from a very different life. They never had to spend the night in an old barracks with creaks, piles of garbage, floors, and crowds of cockroaches. They don't have drunken neighbors keeping them up at night. These lucky people wear expensive fancy clothes, fly to exotic places with luxurious names, drive beautiful cars. A different world that Emily had only ever been able to observe from the outside. After a day of work in the midst of beauty and luxury, it was unpleasant and painful for Emily to return to her shabby apartment. From upstairs came swearing and profanity. A man's husky voice shouted foul language, and a woman's voice responded with equally harsh words. Emily covered her ears, not wanting to hear it. It was getting dreary. The gray life seemed bleak, joyless, and alien. Then Emily remembered her early childhood, a time when she was truly happy. A sunny summer morning. Her mother was tying her a beautiful bow. The girl admired her reflection in the mirror. Just a doll, smiled her mother, correcting the collar of the dress of her favorite daughter, and they would go to the park. Mom was on vacation. They didn't go to the sea, they didn't have enough money. Emily understood that perfectly well, even at the age of 7. But her mother promised to take her daughter to the amusement park and allowed her to choose any swings and merry-go-rounds without restrictions. How pleasant it was to walk hand in hand with her mother down the alley to the park, from where music, cheerful chatter, and children's laughter were already coming. It was light and joyful at heart. Emily felt beautiful and happy. And most importantly, her mother was near, always calm and warm. It was a pity that she had to work so much. But Emily understood otherwise. There was no other way, because they had no daddy, so Mom had to pull everything alone. Emily helped as much as she could, cleaning, even learning to cook simple dishes. Emily smiled as she lay in bed. The noise upstairs didn't bother her anymore. She thought of her mom, her slender silhouette, her long hair. Beautiful. What a clear voice she had. But her mother's face was lost in the fog. No matter how hard Emily tried, she couldn't remember its features. Probably because when they were separated forever, Emily was only 9 years old. She barely reached her mother's shoulder. Emily had always admired her mother's face. However, she rarely saw that face in everyday life. It was a shame, but it couldn't be helped. But she still had the pictures. An old, thick album, slightly battered by time. It was practically the only thing Emily had inherited from her mother, except for a simple pair of gold earrings, a chain, and her mother's dainty wristwatch, all of which Emily had received upon graduation from the orphanage. She had nothing else. Emily realized that she and her mother lived poorly and very lonely. Emily had no grandparents or uncles and aunts. It was true that her mom's friends often came to their small apartment. They brought Emily presents and played with her. It was fun and enjoyable, but still not the same. Emily was secretly jealous of her friends who went to visit their grandmothers every now and then. Listening to the girls' stories about the hot cakes and candy the old people gave them, Emily was envious. She, too, wished she had many relatives. The girl, still very young, felt some emptiness in her chest. But she couldn't express her feelings clearly. Sometimes she tried, but her mother hugged her and asked, "Is it bad together?" No, answered the girl. Of course she was happy with her mom. Emily did not want to upset her favorite person. Therefore, she tried not to ask questions about relatives. And suddenly Mom will think that Emily is bad with her, since she dreams of someone else. One day, something strange happened. It was New Year's Eve. Mom had some guests over, her co-workers. They all together decorated the Christmas tree, cooked salads, joked a lot, laughed, and even led round dances to the joy of the girl. It was fun. And then Emily was tired and went to bed. And the adults continued the celebration in the kitchen. Emily heard muffled voices coming from there. Her friends were clearly engrossed in conversation. The girl was suddenly bored. She got out of bed and went to the bookcase, deciding to read a little, especially since someone from the guests gave her a big book of brightly colored fairy tales with pictures. But for some reason, the girl took a puffy photo album from the shelf. Emily liked to look at the pictures. The pictures were of her mom, either with friends or alone. Some of the photos preserved moments when Emily wasn't even alive yet. On others, she was already a newborn in a cradle and onesies. There were school pictures of Emily and fresh ones. That evening, the girl noticed that there was something under one of her mother's portraits. Emily gingerly ran her fingers under the picture and pulled out an old, folded-in-half photograph. It was wrinkled, as if someone had been looking at it for a long time. There were strangers looking at the girl from the picture. Among them was her mother, who was very young. Everyone had gathered in the flowering garden, apparently for a picnic, for they were sitting on a blanket spread under the trees. The men and women were smartly and richly dressed. A lady with a heavy gaze and regal posture stood out. High hairstyle, large eyebrows, a mole on her cheek resembling a bold drop of wine, bracelets, a massive necklace. This look somehow didn't fit with the picnic. Even 9-year-old Emily could see that. Strange, why had the photograph turned up hidden? And who were these people? The girl immediately had a lot of questions. And so she, grabbing the mysterious photo, went to the kitchen. "Oh, why aren't you asleep?" wondered Aunt Sandy, one of Mom's friends. She made a quick gesture to hide her cigarette under the table. Emily grinned, as if she hadn't noticed anything, as if she wasn't aware that adults were sneaking smokes from her. It was funny. "Are we making noise disturbing you?" No, Emily shook her head. "I found this interesting picture. I want to know about it." "What kind of picture?" With a smile, her mom held out her hand to the find. Emily saw the picture and turned pale. The smile fell off her face instantly. Aunt Cynthia peered over her mother's shoulder and grew serious as well. "Who's next to you?" Emily asked. "They're different, aren't they?" "They all are," her mother replied in an indifferent tone. "It's nothing special. I used to work with them, these people. They're your colleagues?" "Well, you could say that. Where did you all work together?" "Doing what?" Emily kept up. "Go to bed? It's late?" Her mother said quietly, pushing her daughter toward the kitchen. She left the picture with her. Emily walked out, closing the door behind her, but she didn't go into her room, instead lurking near the kitchen. She thought the adults were about to start discussing the photograph. The girl was not mistaken. "Why do you keep this picture?" Aunt Cynthia asked. "Why do you throw it away?" "I wanted to crumple it up and throw it in the garbage. But then I decided not to, because someday I guess I'll have to tell the truth. But not now, of course. She's just a little girl." Aunt Cynthia's voice was unusually quiet. She seemed to sense something. She saw the way Emily looked at her, like she recognized her grandmother, a call of the blood. No, her mother dismissed her friend's words. "She's just wearing necklaces, rings. The clothes are the most beautiful, flashy." And that mole on her cheek caught her eye. She liked attention. I don't know. I think Emily sensed something familiar, like some elusive trait or something. She did. She recognized her grandmother. I saw the way she looked at her. Oh, her grandmother was a bad person. No good. Emily's lucky she's far away from her. On the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, if Emily lived like a princess now, she'd never be denied anything. And me? I can't even take her to the seaside like a princess, said Aunt Susan contemptuously. Have you forgotten?
Was it a good thing to do to a baby? I remember that, but maybe things are different now, who knows? The conversation then turned to another subject, Aunt Cynthia's many admirers. Emily tiptoed to her bed, covered her head with a blanket, and thought. So that woman in the picture with the mole on her cheek, wearing the necklace, was her grandmother. But her mother had always said they were alone, that they had no one. Why hide the truth? And Aunt Susan said Grandma was a bad person. Why would she think that? What did Grandma do? We'd have to ask her mother about it.
Emily dreaded this conversation, seeing how her mother changed at the sight of the photograph, how frightened she was of something, even pale. Everything must be asked. Only later, when the moment was right. Her mother came quietly into the room. Emily pretended to be asleep. The woman took the album from the table, leafed through it, sighed, and returned the photograph to its place under her portrait. Since then, Emily had often looked at that picture. When her mother wasn't around, of course. The domineering woman with the cold and frankly contemptuous gaze was no stranger to her now. Emily knew it was her grandmother. Perhaps they would even see each other someday. That was Emily's last happy year. The next New Year's Eve she met at the Zaria orphanage. Confused, scared. Because in early December her mother was hit at a crosswalk by a drunk driver at high speed. She was not even taken to the hospital in time. Emily spent a few days with Aunt Cynthia, her mom's friend, and then people came, 2 men in uniform and a woman with a stern, cold stare. Aunt Cynthia gathered her favorite things and hugged her niece. Tears rolled from the woman's eyes. I'll visit you, she promised. For several years in a row, she faithfully visited Emily at the orphanage once or even twice a month. The girl looked forward to these meetings. A familiar loved one reminded her of a past happy life, however. Then Susan met another man of her dreams and left with him to another city. Their dating stopped. By that time, Emily had already quite settled in the orphanage and even made friends. It turned out that life in the orphanage was quite tolerable. Children were well fed, clothed, taught, and entertained. They were taken to the movies, circus, and sent to summer camps. Of course, maternal love, care, and warmth Emily very much lacked. She often remembered her mother before going to bed, sometimes smiling and sometimes crying. In the orphanage, the girl learned about the surprising truth about herself. It turned out that her mom was not her own. Emily was about 14 years old when she accidentally overheard the conversation of the educators. The women were discussing the difficult fates of children in the hall after the holiday. They'd had a few drinks, relaxed, and their tongues were loose and their guard was down. The educators were sitting on a sofa in the hall. They thought everyone was asleep by now, for about half an hour ago they had been called out. But Emily was on duty that night, which meant cleaning up after everyone else. She was the one the kindergartners were discussing. What's Emily's fate? Sighed Alana, a full woman with huge glasses. One has to think about it. After all, she was left an orphan. They say lightning never strikes twice her partner. A very young girl named Emma shook her head. And something incredible has already happened to Emily. Emily, who was walking nearby, froze and listened. Something very strange was happening. You know, she was dropped off to this woman, right on her doorstep, just like in the Middle Ages, Alana clarified. Apparently someone knew she was dreaming of children, but God wouldn't let her. We're all aware of it here, Emma nodded. Emily is such a beauty. She has so much innate nobility about her. I wonder who her real parents are. Maybe the daughter of some rich people walking around? Got rid of the disgrace. No, objected a colleague. More likely some alcoholics planted her. Who else does that to children? My mom wasn't my own. Emily couldn't hide any longer. She needed to know for sure. The kindergartners were embarrassed by the gossip. But the way back was closed. Emily had heard everything. You would have found out anyway, but later, at graduation, Alana admitted quietly. You were dropped off by your foster mom. And then she died, and you were orphaned again. Don't worry, you're an adult. You'll be back on your feet soon, and it won't matter anymore, Emma encouraged. Do you know anything about my real parents? No, Alana looked at Emily with pity. Your mom didn't even try to find out anything. Probably was glad she had you and was afraid the relatives would take you away. Emily returned to the bedroom. She had learned the truth of her fate. The news seemed like it should have shocked her. But somehow the girl remained calm and even cool-headed. Did it matter whether her mother was her own or not? The main thing was that they were very happy together. The girl had no doubt that her mother loved her. Later, Emily began to think about her real parents. Who are they? What made them give? Up the child. Are they still alive?
Does she look like them? The girl realized that when she grew up, she would definitely try to find them. However, she had no idea where to start looking for them. She had no information about her relatives, except that Cynthia, a close friend of her foster mother, might have known something. Surely they must have shared secrets with each other, but finding Cynthia herself would be difficult. A few more years passed. Emily came of age and left the orphanage. She was given a modest inheritance, simple jewelry of her mother, an old photo album, and the keys to the apartment. The first thing the girl did was to check if the mysterious photo with the bossy woman and her grandmother was still there. I wonder if it was her real grandmother or her adopted grandmother. Probably couldn't tell now.
At first, Emily was in complete shock at the apartment she had received from the state. Of course, she was very frightened by the new neighbors. It was not easy for the girl to adapt in the orphanage. She had friends. Teachers supported her. But now, in her new life, she found herself completely alone. She had to learn everything on her own: cooking, cleaning, paying for utilities. Emily could not get a job as a cook. They would not take her anywhere without experience. So she got a job as a cleaner, cleaning the entrances of apartment buildings. The hard work took a lot of effort, and the pay was low. But there was no choice. She had to live on something and pay the bills. One of Emily's partners, Aunt Susan, once pitied the girl. It is clear why I clean at my age. It is just a part-time job to buy gifts for grandchildren. And you are young, beautiful. Can't you find something better?
If they won't hire you as a cook, why don't you try a job as a maid in a rich house? They'll hire you for sure. You're as pretty as a picture. And rich people appreciate beauty. Emily decided to take Susan's advice. In the evening, she called several advertisements for maids. She didn't like the first house. The owner was too frank in his scrutiny of the young girl, but the second place attracted her much more. The interview was conducted by a stately grey-haired manager, John. It turned out that the owner of the house is an older woman, but Emily may never meet her, as she is hired to work in the guest houses and on the grounds. The main house has its own staff of servants. When John named the salary, Emily knew she had to get the job. "Thank you for your time," John smiled charmingly, signaling that the conversation was over.
We have a few more candidates today, but I'll be honest, you've made the best impression on me. So wait for the call. I'll probably call you back. John walked Emily the other way. They descended a staircase with carved railings, and the girl had a stunning view of paradise before her. Wooden lounge chairs under umbrellas, slender palm trees, and a huge pool of fancifully shaped turquoise water. On the side of the pool sat a tanned, handsome boy of about 15 with merry eyes, exposing his body to the sun's rays. Emily and a slightly younger girl were lying on a lounge chair by the pool. She was wearing a white swimsuit, emphasizing her stunning tan. Next to her was a guy. They both seemed very nice and handsome to Emily. She couldn't help but admire them. These teenagers lived in a completely different world, unaware of the existence of dysfunctional neighborhoods where children grow up unsupervised while their parents wait for government benefits. Emily sighed, wishing she were in their shoes sunbathing by the pool, swimming in the turquoise water. "These are the landlady's grandchildren," John explained, noticing her interest. "They're well-mannered and good kids. But if you stay to work for us, you need to know this: do not approach the hosts or guests unless necessary. If you are needed, you will be called." Emily nodded. John's words hurt her unpleasantly. She immediately felt like a second-class citizen. However, she really needed this job. If the owners paid her the promised amount, she could save up for a new place to live. Besides, it was so nice to work here, not like scrubbing dirty entrances day after day. That evening, John called back and told her that Emily had been hired. After that, she couldn't sleep for a long time with excitement, making plans for the future. For almost a year now, Emily has been working at the house. She gets up at 6 a.m., goes to the bus stop, takes a long bus ride to the bus terminal, and from there it's a long walk to the owner's house. But she's used to it. The pay is good, the work is not difficult, the conditions are more than excellent, and she is fed heartily in the kitchen. She can be patient. In the course of her work, Emily has made friends with the cooks Kevin and Alex, the janitor Fred, and the young maids Melanie and Roxy. Even John had developed a warm relationship with her. He seemed to pity her as an orphan, though he tried not to show it was out of status. There were servants from the main house, where the mistress herself lived. Emily hardly ever crossed paths with them, as their territories did not touch. She was responsible for order in 4 small guest houses and gazebos, where relatives and acquaintances of the mistress often rested. Guests came all the time, and someone always lived in one of the cabins. Some people showed up regularly, others only once or twice during the whole time. So Emily, Melanie, and Roxy were always busy. Often relatives' grown children, grandchildren came to visit, but they stayed in the main house with their mother and grandmother. This mansion looked like a palace with white walls, monumental look, and luxurious elements of decoration: columns, stucco, winding staircases, huge windows, balconies of bizarre shapes. All this looked solemn and very expensive. Emily never went inside the main house. She was not allowed inside. The servants lived there, whom she hardly knew, but saw only from a distance stern women and trim men in uniforms. They looked down on the rest of the servants. Emily decided that working in the main house was the ultimate privilege with higher salaries. She was interested in looking inside and seeing how things worked, but couldn't. In an entire year, Emily had never once met the landlady in person. Sometimes she saw her from afar, when she was walking to her car or entering the house. But it was rare, and she'd never gotten a good look at her. She was tall, straight as a stick, always beautifully dressed in the summer, wearing her usual wide-brimmed hat and half-face sunglasses. In the cold season, again in a hat with brim, but warm and wearing a black coat. You couldn't see his face behind such a disguise, but Emily had gotten a good look at her hostess's gait. The woman never went down to the pool. Fred explained to the curious Emily that the big house also has a huge pool, with a bridge and even a small waterfall. Emma Susan swims only in it. The girl immediately wanted to see this miracle, but access to the house was closed to her. In the outdoor pool in the summer loved to splash in guests and hostesses, friends, grandchildren, and numerous relatives. At certain hours, the servants were allowed to swim there. Emily never missed an opportunity to take a dip in the clear, cool water. At those moments, she felt like a mermaid and tried not to think about the fact that after all this luxury, she would have to return to her apartment to listen to the neighbors scolding. inhale the unpleasant smells of poverty and desolation, and see the grayness and squalor around her. But she's not the only one. Her new friends Melanie and Roxy, they also have a difficult fate. Melanie was raised by her grandmother from an early age, because the girl never had a father, and Mom started a new life, where the eldest daughter had no place. And Roxy literally ran away from her family. She lived in the village, parents drank, gave birth to children. And it was Roxy who had to look after the whole horde. The girl always dreamed of a better life, and after graduating from school rushed to the city. She planned to go to university, but it didn't work out. But she found a good job, got a job in a rich house. Of course, the girl's servants often discussed their mysterious mistress in their daily work. Maybe she was hiding from everyone because of her terrible scars. Roxy speculated. She loved soap operas and had a vivid imagination. What if her jealous lover poured something on her when she was young? Or they were in a terrible accident together when they were hiding from relatives? Didn't approve of their union. Oh, come on, the practical Melanie waved her hand at her. He just doesn't think we're worthy of his attention. That's why she always passes us by. Are we just bugs to her? Sometimes Fred the janitor joined the conversation. I heard that she had some grief in her life a long time ago. But she still can't get over it. She's our landlady. I heard John talking to the servants in the cottage about it, saying that the mistress is sad today because it's an anniversary, a misfortune. What kind of misfortune? I didn't understand. Through such conversations, the image of the mistress became more and more mysterious and mysterious. Emily wanted to see her up close and personal, but she was never able to do so. One day, John overheard the gossip of the young people. Don't you have enough work to do? Why do you talk with your tongues? Emily and the other young servants were not afraid of him. The strictness of the major of the house was contrived, and the workers themselves worked hard, tried. The salaries were decent, and no one wanted to lose his place. So their work was not to be faulted. But John, as a manager by status, is supposed to remain firm and rigid. Tell us about the landlady, Emily asked bluntly. I wondered why she was so distant, so mysterious. She doesn't go out into the garden. It was a risky request. He could get angry and call the girl a curious barbarian, judging and sticking his nose where it didn't belong. That would have been quite in his nature. But the man suddenly, to the surprise and delight of the three friends, opened up Pamela as a golden person. She's kind, generous, which you couldn't help but notice. She does a lot for her sons and grandchildren. She also helps poor children. That's great, smiled Emily. But why such mystery and detachment? Someone is always coming to see her, and she doesn't talk to anyone but her closest friends. Well, first of all, the mistress is already in years. At your age, you want to have fun and socialize. And people like Pamela and I prefer peace and quiet. Don't be modest, you didn't make eye contact. The house majordomo did. Roxy, you're a big girl. I was, John grinned at her, and continued, but fate is often unfair. There was once in Pamela's life a great sorrow died her only daughter, the youngest and late child. Clever girl, beautiful, the favorite of the whole family. And after all, how sudden and terrible everything happened. The girl flew to study in England, and the plane was in a plane crash. Of course, no one survived. Wow, Melanie couldn't help but sigh. So finish your theories about the mistress to build. You think I can't hear you talking? Scars. Unhappy love. John gave Roxy an expressive look. Well, ever since then, Pamela has been averse to noisy society, socializing and all that. She seldom gives soirees, only on the most solemn occasions. It tires her. She's changed a lot since the tragedy, and now she's getting older. So that's the story. There's nothing mysterious about the landlady. Just an unhappy person. Emily thought long and hard about the majordomo's words. It turns out that you can have all this beauty and still be unhappy. Emily rolled onto her other side again, looking out the window. In the light of the street lamp, night insects were hovering. Crumbs of them were reaching for the light at the upstairs neighbors. Everything seemed to have quieted down. Finally, the girl closed her eyes. Quiet, good, calm. Emily didn't notice how she fell into a long-awaited sleep. The morning began, as usual, with the shrill ringing of the alarm clock. She struggled to open her eyelids. She had fallen asleep very late last night. She desperately wanted to spend at least half an hour in bed, but she couldn't, because the bus wouldn't wait for her. Emily struggled to get her head off the pillow and walked into the bathroom with her eyes still closed. A cool shower was always invigorating. The girl had a quick breakfast of a sausage sandwich and coffee. Melanie had said that someday the habit of such a breakfast would turn Emily into a fat woman, one who couldn't fit into decent clothes. But so far, the irregular gastronomic habits had had no effect on the girl's figure. Emily pulled on short denim shorts and a long, wide t-shirt, made a high ponytail, put her feet in sneakers, threw her backpack with a swimsuit, phone and purse over her shoulders, and left the house. At this hour, all her non-traveling neighbors were usually asleep, resting from the night's adventures. So walking down the road leading to the bus stop was even pleasant. But in the evening, Emily was always a little afraid to come home. She was especially scared of Kevin, the local first guy in the village. He even seemed to be working somewhere in the city, but like all his companions, he managed to drink almost every day, not denying himself the pleasure of having another affair. But everyone knew that Kevin had his eye on Emily. That was what frightened the girl, because if one day Kevin went from trying to get to know her more intimately to taking action, there would be no one to protect her. She was all alone. It would be good to go to work at the central cottage. The servants from there rarely leave the house. They even have a separate wing where they live. I wish Emily could do that too, she thought. And then Emily spent an hour traveling through the city on a half-empty bus. On the next trip, the bus would be crowded with people rushing to work, so that there would be no place for an apple to fall. In the meantime, it was quiet, calm, and peaceful. Emily even had time for a little nap. She opened the servant's gate with her own key and found herself in the garden. It was deafening, dizzying with scents the grass had not yet recovered from the dew. Emily inhaled a full breath and smiled. How nice, beautiful, pleasant, and most importantly, safe. Hi. Alex smiled at her friend. She almost always came before everyone else. She lived nearby. Roxy had already had time to change into her uniform, a strict dress of soft pink color with buttons. Good morning. John is gathering us all at 8:30 in the big gazebo. He has some important announcement. Either about today's guests or something else happened. All right, I'll get changed and I'll be there. This was unusual in Emily's memory. It was the first time the master of the house had organized a general meeting. Usually he gave his orders in person. This was an intrigue. When Emily arrived at the gazebo, everyone was already gathered there, including the almost unfamiliar servants from the main house. Her friends waved her over to join us. They took a seat for her. Well, it looks like we're all here now, John said, looking around at his subordinates. We're good to go. It turned out that in 2 weeks' time the hostess had an anniversary. On this occasion, a big celebration is planned. About 100 guests, invited musicians, artists John listed, in the evening after the concert fireworks. The event is big and responsible. I want everyone to understand that on this day everything should be at the highest level. It turned out that the efforts of the people at the cottage were not enough to serve the guests. Melanie, Roxy, and Emily, as young, pretty, and quick-witted as they are, were planned to be waitresses. Could we manage? Melanie hesitated. I've never catered a banquet before. Of course, you'll be brief, John reassured her. In fact, it's nothing new. You've done the same thing before. It's just a bigger event than usual. Emily remained calm outwardly. But in her heart, she was jubilant. She would finally be allowed into the house. She'd wanted to go there for so long. And she would be able to get a good look at her mistress. And the holiday promised to be big. There would be dressed-up guests, musicians, singers. Fireworks are planned. There'll be something to see. From then on, the house was filled with talk of the upcoming celebration. John, as promised, instructed the future waitresses. It turned out nothing complicated. Walk with a tray around the room and watch the guests. If someone makes a sign, go up to that person and offer appetizers or drinks, always with a polite smile. Emily had done something like this several times before at holiday meals. But now, it was much more serious, and the event itself was to be held at the mysterious center cottage. With a slight polite smile, John said indignantly, glaring at Roxy, "Why are you smiling with all 32 teeth? Be softer, calmer, more elegant. Look at your friend." Emily smiled. She was really good at it. John praised her grace and coordination, setting her as an example to others. And remember, he said for the 100th time, don't forget the main rule: no unnecessary talking, glances, or personal contact with guests. You must blend in with the interior, be just an addition to it, not draw attention to yourself. Melanie nodded gravely. We'll try. I promise, Roxy said. Closer to the party, the decorators arrived. They decorated the garden with garlands and light fountains, put transparent statues, even built a pond with large fish. As the solemn event approached, Emily became more and more nervous. But her interest grew. One day the servants were brought in to try on a festive uniform for the event. For men, maroon pants and a plaid vest. For women, a vest and skirt of the same shade. Strict business style. It suits you very well, admired friends, looking at Emily. You're a real model. Emily smiled. She liked it very much herself. She had never dressed so strictly and businesslike before. Jeans, t-shirts, light sundresses. It turns out that the office style really suited her. And now, finally, the long-awaited day had come. The night before, Emily hadn't slept much. The neighbors were walking, then overhead noise, then wandered with laughter and songs under the windows. But it was the excitement that kept her awake the most. All these preparations for the anniversary are behind us. And tomorrow the culmination. A grandiose celebration. If only everything went smoothly. The next day the waitress's dress rehearsal was scheduled, and John led the girls into the central cottage for the first time. Emily even felt dizzy at first at how spacious it was. A huge space in which the huge corner sofas and comfortable armchairs were lost. There were long tables along the walls. Like I said, there's going to be a buffet, John said. Everything was bright, clean, glossy. Emily couldn't stop looking around. Upstairs was a wide staircase with a comfortable banister. What was on the second floor? One could only guess. The room where the banquet was planned didn't look like a living space. Beautiful, spacious, but too formal. Emily didn't see any of the little things that could tell something about the hostess's personality. Photographs, statuettes, paintings. It was as cold and aloof as Pamela herself. John grinned as he looked at the surprised girls. What? Impressed? Of course you are, it's so big. That's why I brought you here in advance, so you wouldn't open your mouths in front of the guests, he said. And in general, whatever you see, keep yourself in control, stay calm. Why does she need such a big house? Roxy continued to wonder. And those guest houses, and the huge garden. I don't understand. It's none of your business, John said, clearly unhappy with her statement. The time before dinner flew by in a flurry of activity and preparation. Then the girls were told to rest, so that they wouldn't be tired in the evening. The friends didn't mind. They settled down in the servants' wing and lay on the sofa until the evening, chatting and watching light serials. Strange sounds came from the garden. It was musicians tuning their instruments. A little later, the artists and singers arrived. People from their team spent a long time fiddling with lighting and electronics, preparing the stage. Time flew by quickly. At 6 p.m., an excited John came in and told the girls to change. Is it really starting already? The girls looked at each other with excitement. Emily felt something cold rumbling in her stomach. The guests began to arrive, men in perfectly tailored suits, women in evening gowns. They looked like performers from rich living movies. And though Emily had promised John not to stare or stare, she couldn't help but stare openly at the arrivals, the outfits, the jewelry, the accessories. She'd never seen such splendor in the stores. Obviously, they'd bought their clothes elsewhere. Emily, dazzled by the luxury of the evening, did not even recognize Christina, the granddaughter of the hostess. Usually she dressed like a teenager, but tonight she looked like a princess. Her flowing, long golden dress was beautifully fitted. Her long hair was arranged in an elegant bun. The girl admired the young beauty. Don't forget why you're here, John whispered softly in her ear. Why are you three so confused? Emily pulled herself together and walked slowly down the hall with the tray, just as she'd been trained to do all week. The hostess was here, too. She appeared to be in her 70s. But Pamela didn't look her age, tall, statuesque, in an elegant long gown, with natural makeup and exquisite jewelry. She held herself with dignity, but at the same time she was friendly, smiling at the guests, trying to pay attention to everyone. For some reason, Pamela seemed vaguely familiar to Emily. She even shared it with Melanie. Wow, her friend grinned. You've been working here for a year, and you've seen her many times, even from afar. She should be familiar to you. Oh, I think my name is. But Emily disagreed with Melanie. Yes, she'd seen her landlady in passing, but her face was always hidden by her glasses and hat brim. No, now Emily saw her face for the first time, and it did seem familiar. Strange. One day Emily had walked up close to Pamela as she was talking to a gray-haired man, and he had called a waitress over to take a glass of champagne. Pamela was distracted for a moment, glancing away, and then returned to the conversation. The girl had time to notice a small scar on her hostess's cheek, a small indentation. The evening went on as usual. The guests moved into the garden. There was a stage on which the musicians put on an enchanting show. On the big screen behind their backs appeared amazingly realistic pictures of forest, then mountains, then in general some fantastic landscapes. Some of the artists were unfamiliar to Emily, while others she often saw on the TV screen. Real stars came to congratulate Pamela. Emily could not even imagine how much the celebration had cost the hostess. It didn't fit with John's words that Pamela didn't like noisy society, fuss and so on. Emily asked her husband about it at home during the concert. He, seeing that the party was going well, was in a good mood, and so he answered, however, with some strange phrase, "Kings can do anything." And kings can do anything, the man sang, winking at Emily. She didn't understand. Her position obliged her. What's not to understand? It's a status requirement to throw an anniversary party. That's what they do. I see now. Pamela is tired. She doesn't like it. Can't you tell? Emily glanced at her hostess. She looked energetic and enthusiastic. But perhaps her husband knows her better. He might know better. The guests were having fun, singing along to the artists. Some of them even danced. There were amazingly beautiful light fountains everywhere. Garlands hung by designers turned the garden into a setting for a magical fairy tale. Finally, the concert ended. Pamela's sons, grown, solid men, came on stage and made an insanely moving speech. Emily almost cried and keenly felt her own orphanhood. They were grown-up, established businessmen. They have families and big children themselves. But how much they needed Emma, how much they loved her. You could feel it in every word of these men. Then the guests spoke. They said a lot of nice words about the Jubilee. Alex didn't know what an amazing person her hostess was. It turns out that she is engaged in charity, helps sick children and orphans, supervises several orphanages. Now Alex found out about it. At the end, they prepared a surprise for Pamela, a video about her life with beautiful music. On a huge screen mounted on the stage, photos flashed. At first black and white. On them, Pamela was very young, thin, angular, with a kind of uncertain, timid look, little resembling the powerful woman she was now. Wedding pictures, pictures from work, photos on the doorstep of the maternity ward, family photos where Pamela is surrounded by her family, her husband, 2 boys and a tiny girl. This must be the daughter who died in the plane crash. How sad. Pamela changed, became tougher, more confident. She liked to dress lavishly and flamboyantly. Now she posed in beautiful outfits and massive jewelry, rings, earrings, chains. There was something unpleasant in her eyes. Was it contempt? No, Alex liked the modern Pamela much better. But that middle-aged mistress from the photos reminded Alex desperately of someone. The girl couldn't figure out who. And then she saw her. A familiar picture. From the big screen, Alex was looking at the woman from the picture her mom had once hidden from her. Kind of like her grandmother had loved her. It was so unexpected that the girl dropped her tray. Fortunately, everyone was engrossed in the spectacle. No one even noticed it. The heavy necklace around her neck, the stern look, the mole on her cheek. There was no mistaking it. It was surprising to see a familiar photograph on the big screen. The frame changed. Pamela was rapidly growing up on the screen. Milestones of her life flashed by at high speed. Alex stood thunderstruck. Maybe she was just imagining things. Could it be? Hardly. Now the girl realized who her hostess reminded her of the very woman from the mysterious photo. Except that there was no mole on her cheek now. But in its place there was a scar, a small depression. Alex noticed it as she walked by. Probably Pamela at one point simply got rid of the natural ornament, removed the mole. So what's it look like? Alex works at her grandmother's house. If her mom were alive, she'd answer all the questions. But now we have to find out the truth on our own. And it has to be subtle, not blunt. Then there was a festive fireworks. Multicolored flashes bloomed in the sky. Some of them took fanciful forms: heart, rainbow, stars. Everyone in the garden admired the fireworks. People's faces were looking up, and only Alex was looking solely at Pamela. Her face reflected blue, red, and green reflections. The birthday girl was smiling. Alex scrutinized every feature of her face and realized more and more clearly that yes, this was the woman from the photo. After the party, Alex stayed overnight in the servants' wing. There was no point in going home. The guests had left at midnight, and it was already time to get up. Especially at this hour, it wasn't safe to walk around the neighborhood where Alex lived. Roxy had gone home. She was renting an apartment nearby. Melanie stayed in the outhouse, too. The girls made themselves comfortable on the big couch, turned off the light. Tomorrow was going to be a long and laborious day of cleaning. Of course, additional people had been hired, but there was still a lot of work to do. Melanie fell asleep quickly. But Alex, of course, couldn't sleep. What had she seen today? What did it mean? She wanted to share the news with someone. But Alex realized she shouldn't. It became unbearably stuffy. Alex got up and opened the window. Night freshness was blowing from the street. The girl decided to take a little walk in the garden. Maybe she would get tired and fall asleep after all. It was dark in the garden. Lanterns were burning only on the porch of the big cottage. The guest cottages were packed to the brim tonight. Muffled conversations came from there. Apparently, no Emily had slept well after the party. The girl walked over to the pool, sat down on the edge, and looked at the cottage. Somewhere out there right now, Pamela is asleep or awake, Emily thought. Emily wanted to ask her a lot of questions, but the hostess was practically out of reach. How to approach her, where to start a conversation. But one thing Emily knew for sure, she would make up her mind. She would find a way to find out. A week had passed since the anniversary. Life went on as usual. Emily went to work every day, ran John's errands, talked to Melanie and Roxy. Only now there was always that mysterious photograph in her pocket. Emily waited for the moment when Pamela would meet. And then, Ian. Then Emily would boldly approach her, show her the photograph, and ask the questions that had been nagging at her since the anniversary. But time passed. Pamela sometimes glimpsed somewhere in the distance, then to the parking lot, went to the house. Then a quick step went into the house, or in general appeared not alone, but accompanied by relatives or acquaintances. The right moment never came. It was tormenting Emily. "Emily, you haven't been the same lately," Melanie said one day, pale, anxious. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Emily smiled. She didn't want to tell anyone, not even her closest friends, about her story yet. "Maybe you're in love?" Roxy asked with a sly look in her eyes. Emily sighed. If only it were that simple. One day the girl made up her mind. If the mountain does not go to Mohammed, Emily realized it is necessary to act more actively. The moment when Pamela would accidentally get in her way, there might not be. It was early September. The days were sunny and warm. The air was filled with dizzying aromas of blooming herbs. Bright butterflies fluttered. And by evening it was getting crisp. Emily liked this time. She was cleaning the gazebo near the central cottage. Today Pamela's guests were having dinner here, an elderly couple with a little boy, a grandson perhaps. The hostess herself was not with them. Pamela had gone into town on business this morning. Emily now knew that the hostess spent a lot of time on charity, supervising foundations, orphanages, and hospitals. Emily was just checking the wide, long table in the gazebo when she saw them. Pamela and John were walking down the path to the house, talking quietly about something. The hostess, as usual, was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and dark glasses. I couldn't see her face, but her gait, her posture, her figure. No, Emily would never mistake Pamela for anyone else. John gallantly opened the door for the lady. She smiled at him and stepped inside, and the man approached Emily. "Well done," he praised the girl's work. Quick, clean, as always. The man was clearly in a high mood, and he wanted everyone around him to smile. Apparently, the conversation with the hostess had been pleasant. When he left, Emily put the rag aside, glanced around the house, fumbled for the doubled-up photograph in her pocket. Sigh. Now or never, she thought. Emily slowly approached the door, glancing around every now and then. It seemed that John or one of the household servants was about to appear. Of course, they would scold her. After all, Emily knew perfectly well that she wasn't allowed to enter this house without permission. It is not her territory. She is not on the staff of the privileged servants whose duties include the upkeep of the cottage. Emily felt like a trespasser, almost a criminal, when she took the doorknob. Still, She took the step and found herself back in the spacious hall. Without the long tables along the walls, it seemed even larger and more spacious than Emily remembered from the anniversary. The girl stood for a few moments, listening to the sounds of the house. From somewhere came the muffled clinking of dishes and voices. It must have been the servants. Here would be the story if one of them came out into the hall and saw her looking around. She would be rudely ushered out the door, complaining about the insolent maid to John. And John? He'll probably fire her for all the good he's done her. Because there are strict rules. They're even spelled out in the employment contract. And Emily was brazenly breaking them right now. The girl sighed. Well, the first step has been taken. We have to go all the way. There was no turning back. And she headed straight for the wide staircase that led to the second floor. The landlady was definitely there. Emily easily ran down the steps and was confused again. A wide hallway, many doors. Where to go? At least there was no one there. Pamela came out to Emily on her own. She came around the corner from somewhere. She was wearing a beautiful homemade suit, satin, or silk oversized black pants, and an elegant tunic to match. There was a flicker of surprise in the landlady's eyes at the sight of the girl. But anger Emily did not notice. "You're the girl who looks after the grounds and the guest houses, aren't you?" Pamela asked, giving Emily a glance. Her heart thudded with excitement, and her legs felt strangely woozy. But worst of all was her tongue, which didn't want to turn. "Yes," Emily finally said. "In that case, what are you doing up here? Did John explain the rules to you?" Pamela didn't seem angry or accusing. Her tone was neutral and calm. But still, Emily was gripped by panic. The girl slipped her hand into her pocket, fumbled for the photograph again. The feel of the heavy paper in her fingers suddenly gave her confidence. I need to talk to you," the girl blurted out. Pamela's eyes became interested. I guess it wasn't every day that servants came to her with such requests, and there must have been something about Emily's appearance that caught her attention. "I suggest you go to my room," Pamela said, and moved down the hall. Emily followed her, marveling at her own courage and at how the situation was playing out. The landlady hadn't yelled at her, hadn't called someone to have the brazen intruder kicked out the door. She talks to her calmly, respectfully. And now it's unfathomable. Pamela takes her, the girl in the pink uniform, into her room to listen. Pamela's spacious room had many mirrors, further visualizing the space. Emily took one look at herself, pale, disheveled, anxious. A pitiful sight. Maybe Pamela just felt sorry for her. The woman settled into a chair in front of the round table on molded legs. Emily gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite. "Now I'm listening to you very carefully. Apparently you do have something to say." Under Pamela's scrutinizing gaze, Emily was again a little confused. She couldn't think of the right words. The thing is. Where to start? The girl hesitated, feeling pathetic and stupid. And then suddenly she took a photograph out of her pocket and put it in the center of the table. Pamela took the picture in her hands and studied it for a long time. Emily stared at her hostess's face and tried to understand how she felt. But Pamela was perfectly able to keep herself in control. The girl did not see a single emotion. She even experienced despair. Suddenly she felt that in the rollers for the Jubilee was this very photo. Suddenly the owner now will return the photo to her with the question, well, what next? But it turned out differently. "Where did you get that picture?" Pamela asked. "My mother gave it to me." "Who's your mom?" "What's her name?" "Where is she?" The usual mask of coldness and indifference was gradually slipping from her face. Pamela became more and more like an ordinary woman. An amazing metamorphosis. Emily immediately felt more confident. "My mom's name was Susan." "Well, she was, but she died when I was only 9. Susan, Pamela said thoughtfully. "Who would have thought it?" "Katie, no surprise there." Emily looked at her hostess intently. Pamela's gaze was absent, as if she were thinking somewhere in the past. It was clear that the photograph meant something to her, that there was a connection between them. "That's my mom," Emily jabbed her finger at the skinny girl on the left. "Yes, I remember her well. Jenny served with us for a few years. Good girl, efficient, calm, but I fired her. I was a different person back then. Tell me, who raised you after Jenny was gone?" Pamela asked. "I grew up in an orphanage," Emily answered. Pamela looked at her pityingly, barely holding back tears. Emily saw it perfectly well. "It's my fault. I meant well. And I've done this," Pamela said with strange, incomprehensible words. "I've ruined your life and my daughter's. I'm so sorry for you." Jenny, said Emily firmly. "I heard her talking to a friend of hers once. I understood from it that the woman in the picture was you when you were young." My grandmother Emily lied, deciding to go all in. She had waited too long for this moment to miss the big question. "I guess so," Pamela nodded, looking at Emily. "The DNA test would clear things up for sure. But it's just a formality. I can see the nose, the eyes, the lip line, an amazing resemblance. Explain everything to me," Emily pleaded. "I don't understand anything at all. I'm even a little scared." "Of course I will," Pamela nodded. "Now we'll have plenty of time to understand and learn. I just can't believe it. We've been looking for you for so long, sending out inquiries, even hiring detectives. And here you are, after all these years, when there's no hope left." Pamela began a long story, speaking quietly, measuredly, calmly, stopping at times and shaking her head in disbelief. She had graduated from the Polytechnic Institute, specializing as an engineer. On assignment, she was sent on an internship in a distant city. It happened often then. Pamela did not mind. She always liked adventure. There, at a large factory, she had met her fate, Tom, despite the youth of the already master, to whom the adult men obeyed. Intelligent, determined, energetic, he immediately attracted Pamela. "I still could not believe my happiness," she shared with Emily. "All the women in the factory were making eyes at him, and he chose me, unremarkable, with this ugly mole on my cheek. How I hated it, how many complexes I had because of it. I got rid of it the first chance I got. Tom made me believe I was beautiful. They got married and got a tiny studio apartment from the factory. But it was better than a hostel. They didn't live poorly, but they had enough. They had enough for food, clothes, entertainment, but they didn't have to be lavish. Soon they had a son. Tom was over the moon. And Pamela dreamed of having a daughter. "I have dreamed of a girl since childhood," she admitted. "I imagined how I would dress her up in beautiful dresses, tie puffy bows. And here is a boy. And what a boy! Our eldest, Jason, from a small age, was a tomboy and a fighter for the truth, a real hurricane." Pamela smiled warmly as she talked about her son's childhood. Emily watched her face with all her eyes. She wasn't used to seeing her mistress so human yet. "All in all, the son turned out wonderful. But I never gave up the dream of having a daughter," Pamela continued. "I was sure that next time I would be lucky. I persuaded my husband to have a second child, but John didn't want to. At first, the apartment is small, the three of us can barely fit. But then he gave in. So the family had another boy instead of the desired daughter." Pamela somehow even calmed down. The third child they would certainly not pull. So such is the fate the mama boys to be. Sons pleased, grew healthy and smart, distinguished. At school they helped at home. I simply adored them and would never trade any of them for a daughter. But looking at moms, walking hand in hand with little princesses, still longed. The dream of having a daughter hasn't gone anywhere. The woman simply drove it into the recesses of her subconscious because she realized that there was no way they could afford a third child. And then came the hard times, those very hungry 90s. The factory went bankrupt. John was left without a job. In the design office where I worked, the wages began to be delayed. Then, of course, they gave me several months' paychecks at once. But not in money, but in coupons to stores where the prices were so high that you couldn't even get near them. It was hard, Pamela recalled. John, a longtime engineer, worked part-time as a loader or janitor. Interrupted small casual earnings because there was no other way out. I knitted to order. Even the boys worked, looking for and handing in bottles, washing cars. And still there was a catastrophic lack of money. But that's how everyone lived then. It was all perceived as commonplace, wasn't it? What's a daughter? I'd rather put my sons on their feet. And then John took a risk. Together with two former colleagues, organized a construction and installation company. All the founders had experience and connections. After all, they had worked at the factory for so many years. At first, things went shakily. The enterprise did not bring money. On the contrary, the last crumbs were pulled out of the family budget. I did not believe in success, admitted Pamela. I scolded John, called him a fool, suggested that he go yard sweeping. instead of spending time on something incomprehensible. He didn't say a word, didn't argue. I can imagine how upset I made him, but my husband is not the kind of man to give up. Soon the business of the novice businessman went uphill, and within a year the family from almost beggarly to more than wealthy. We bought a new apartment, a 3-bedroom in a good neighborhood. We got a car. I did not deny myself anything, bought beautiful dresses and shoes, jewelry, said Pamela. All this caused the envy of others, and she simply changed the circle of communication. Even then, everyone who did not have such wealth began to seem to me completely insignificant. And yet I was like that myself not so long ago. Strange, but this fact somehow completely erased from my mind. More on that later. The small firm became a large corporation. John has foreign partners, and that's a whole other level. The family moved to a prestigious cottage community. They got servants in this very house with a pool. Now I didn't have to cook or clean. Hired people did all that. A woman could take care of her children and herself. Wealth spoiled me, Pamela admitted. I couldn't cope with the sudden wealth that came over my head. Engaged, simply put, looked at people who do not have such capital as garbage. Dressed flashily, wearing jewelry, even going on a picnic in the garden. Just like in this picture. It's funny even. I didn't think about children anymore. My condition now allowed it, but age. At that time, women over 35 were already considered beyond reproductive age. And yet, when I realized one day that I was pregnant, I didn't even think about termination. I felt it was a long-awaited daughter. Pamela smiled, looking at Emily. And so it turned out to be. Hannah was born, mommy and daddy's joy, the long-awaited princess girl. The boys were all grown up now, and here was a sweet baby again, and a daughter at last, Pamela recalled. She was enjoying motherhood in a new way. Now she had money, for Hannah hired a nanny who took the lion's share of care for the baby. Pamela got only the most pleasant things: walks, outfits, visits to theaters and cafes. Just as she had once dreamed. Even better, because even in her wildest dreams she could not have imagined that she would be able to dress her daughter in such outfits. Hannah grew up in love and total acceptance. She was adored by her parents, her older brothers, and everyone around her. Such an open and pleasant child she was. But favorable appearance not the only thing that nature gifted Hannah. The girl also turned out to be very talented. Since childhood she drew so that people looked and could not believe that these paintings are the result of the labor of a small child. Hannah first attended an art school, then a prestigious design center. Her parents were not stingy, expensive paints, pencils, additional lessons with the best specialists in the city, anything to make their only daughter's talent flourish and develop. It was at this design center that she met your father. She was just 17 at the time. She was finishing high school. We were planning to send her to study in England, preparing her for it. A dizzying career awaited our girl there. I was sure of it. One day I was late and didn't pick up Hannah from the design center on time. Pamela continued. The girl had to wait for me outside the gate for a while. She could have stayed on the grounds of the center. There are comfortable benches, a cozy fountain. Apparently the girl was just curious to see another life, which she had only heard about. She wanted to see what it was like behind the gates. At the same time, a good-looking guy and his friends were passing by. Seeing a pretty girl, obviously waiting for someone, he stopped and fell behind his own. A conversation ensued between the young people, in the course of which sympathy arose. For Hannah, it was all new, unusual. Like an adventure. Pamela shook her head. We didn't know anything and they started dating. Then it turned out that Hannah was purposely making up extra classes at the design center. I'd take her to it with peace of mind, and she'd run out of the gate and go for a walk with him. In the fall, the boy was taken away to the army. Dating stopped by itself, but by New Year's Eve it became clear that Hannah is expecting a child. I noticed the belly. I had seen it before, but I did not even think about it. How? The girl gained a little weight, it's nothing. And closer to the new year, there is no doubt. I talked to Hannah. She confessed everything. I yelled at my daughter for the first time then. My sons and my husband tried to calm me down, but I kept going on and on. I dreamed so much about my daughter. I had so many plans and hopes for her. A talented girl, an excellent student, ahead of her studies in London. And to ruin her future like that, to embarrass herself and her parents. I couldn't take it. We tried to find this guy's parents so we could give the baby to them. But either Hannah was hiding it from us, or she really didn't know anything about him, except his name. She said it didn't matter to her. They were enjoying their youth, the great weather, each other, and didn't ask each other for passport details. Gradually, a plan matured in my mind. No one was to know that Hannah was expecting a child. Now the girl was not let out of the house, not shown to anyone. I also made a deal with the people at the medical center. For a lot of money, they were to deliver the baby when it was due and then hand the baby over to the orphanage. I planned it well and even calmed down a bit, Pamela continued. But things went wrong. Hannah's labor started early, unexpectedly. The girl was patient to the last in her room, not wanting to draw attention to herself. And when she called for help, I've been a mom 3 times, so I knew perfectly well that the doctors wouldn't get to us in time. Because Hannah was about to give birth, Pamela shook her head. I had to do everything myself with the help of the maid. She was a good, faithful girl, of course. But it was I, Emily, who first held you in my arms. Oh my God. So you think I'm Hannah's daughter? The girl said. I'm sure you do, Pamela nodded. There are many things about you that remind me of her, and your story confirms it. It's going to be hard for me to go on. Try to understand me. I was a terrible person back then, tough, controlling. I didn't realize that money, which by the way I didn't even earn, is no reason to despise others, and energy should be directed to good deeds. I would never do that now. With a tiny baby in her arms, Pamela was confused, and then Hannah started to feel sick. The girl lost consciousness. The woman was afraid for her daughter's life. As long as her girl was all right, the rest does not matter. So the newfound grandmother wrapped the baby in a blanket, handed the girl to the maid, and told her to do what she wanted with her, threw her in an orphanage. Threw her in the woods, as long as not a single thread did not lead to their family. Unfortunately, Fred wasn't home. He would have stopped me. I was scared out of my wits, the maid promised. For a good reward, she carried the infant away and said she'd dropped it off on the orphanage's doorstep. It turned out that no one had been dropped off there that day. She was lying, as I later found out when I realized what I had done and threw everything I had into the search. The night her granddaughter was born, Pamela was only relieved when the infant was carried away. Hannah came to her senses, and the first thing she asked about was her daughter. When she realized she was gone, she threw a tantrum, sobbing, smashing dishes, breaking furniture, venting her emotions. Pamela was then frightened. It seemed to her that her daughter had gone mad, unable to bear the shock. Strong medication prescribed by a doctor saved the situation. Hannah pulled herself together, but became detached, indifferent. She was no longer happy about anything. Even the upcoming study in London, of which she dreamed so much, it was already a completely different person. But I thought I was doing the right thing, Pamela said regretfully. I thought it would be better for everyone, but fate quickly proved me wrong. The next summer, as planned, the whole family saw Hannah off to the airport. The girl was waiting for training with the best specialists and a brilliant career. Pamela was proud of her daughter and herself. After all, she managed to successfully cope with the problem. Thanks to her mother, Hannah started her life with a clean slate. The plane crashed, Pamela said quietly, her face darkening, as if she were reliving the nightmare. No one survived. The only thing Ben said then was if we'd kept the baby, Hannah wouldn't have gotten on that flight. She would have stayed home for a couple more years, taking care of her daughter. I've spent my whole life blaming myself for that. He thought it was our punishment for betraying him. For years, Pamela couldn't find a place for herself. Nothing interested her. Nothing touched her. It was as if the meaning of life had disappeared, and only the marriage of her sons and the birth of grandchildren made her come to her senses. The kids shook me up, brought me to my senses, she said. I realized how much attention and warmth they need, what happiness it is, and I realized that I had to find you, to find Hannah's daughter, my eldest granddaughter. It's the only way I can at least partially redeem myself. And I wanted to see you, to see what you've become, to help you make it in life, after all, just to be there for you. Pamela began her search with the orphanage where a maid, Mariah, had allegedly dropped off a newborn baby. But she quickly found out that the baby had never been there. Mariah was never able to find out the truth. She passed away shortly after the whole story. Pamela didn't give up. She hired the best detectives, searched for information herself. But as the years went by, there were no leads. The woman didn't even want to think that Mariah had done something terrible. Just left the child somewhere in the cold in the woods, so that no one would find it, as she herself had advised her. True, the maid didn't seem like such a cruel person. But who knows? Now I see how it was said, Pamela thoughtfully. Of course you do. Mariah took you to Jennifer. Why didn't I realize that? Jennifer was a single, childless woman who worked in Pamela's house. One day, she ruined her new linens. It was expensive. It was covered in ugly stains because the washing machine malfunctioned. But Pamela didn't want to hear about it at the time. She was still enjoying the sudden wealth that had suddenly fallen on her head, feeling all-powerful. And so she fired Jennifer without remorse. Yes, she was living somewhere in the city, renting an apartment. Pamela nodded. I know she had some health problems that made it impossible for her to have children, even though she wanted them. She knew that very well. So she gave you to her. It was the right thing to do. Logical. She was a good mother to me. Emily's eyes filled with tears. A really good one. And I miss her. I'm grateful to Jennifer for you. I wish I could thank her in person. I also wish Ben had lived to see this moment. It's only 3 years away. How happy would he be now? Grandmother and granddaughter looked at each other in silence. Emily couldn't understand her feelings, a cloud of thoughts swarming in her head. And then Pamela covered Emily's hand with her palm, and the gesture made everything easy to understand. A pleasant warmth spread through Emily's body, and in the soul suddenly began to fill a void that the girl had never known existed before. Everything will be all right now, Pamela smiled. I am so sorry to you, but we'll make up for it. You're not alone now. Yes, Emily nodded. And the tears she had been holding back finally broke through. For the first time in years, she felt needed, loved, and most importantly, loved.